On December 31st, 1999, a dramatic hijacking and hostage crisis ended when the passengers of Air India Flight 814 were released in Kandahar, Afghanistan after an 8-day ordeal. The United States formally turned over the Panama Canal Zone to Panama, finalizing a deal that had been 20 years in the works. The big story that day, of course, was the world was awaiting the coming of the year 2000. In the US particularly, there was a lot of buzz about the Y2K bug, which some feared would cripple the world's computers and institute mass chaos.
Elevators may stop. Heat may vanish. Credit cards and ATMs may cease to function. Airplanes and trains may come to a halt.
But the most important thing in terms of historical importance that happened on that day occurred in the Kremlin in Moscow. Russian President Boris Yeltsin, worn out with heart trouble, bronchitis, and alcoholism, quite suddenly resigned from office. His successor as acting president of Russia was the prime minister, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, age 47, who was a very obscure figure outside of Russia and to some degree within Russia itself. Putin introduced himself to the world with a speech given on New Year's Eve, which was somewhat bland and forgettable. Sitting in front of a Christmas tree, speaking in a dull monotone, Putin looked more like an insurance salesman trying to interest you in a new term policy than the leader of a former superpower. This guy was Russia's new leader? Of course, 25 years later, we now understand just how big a moment that was. Putin has already ruled Russia longer than Nicholas II did, and in the next few years he'll catch up with Stalin in terms of how long he's been in charge. From his own remaking of post-communist Russia, to his assassinations of people he doesn't like, to his meddling in foreign politics like Brexit and the 2016 US presidential election, to the ongoing war in Ukraine that he alone wanted, Putin's mark on the world has been immense and unmistakable. Yet to this day, who he really is, how he thinks, and what he wants are subjects shrouded in mystery, misperception, and misinformation. My name is Sean Munger. I have a PhD in history, and I teach history both online and in person. On my website, seanmunger.com, I have an online class about Vladimir Putin. The link to it is in the description. The thesis of that class is that the key to understanding Putin is to see him in the broader context of Russian history and other Russian rulers of the past, not just communist ones. This video, while related to the class and that thesis, is part of that story. Not the whole thing, but a part of it. The thesis of this video is that before you can place Putin in that proper context of Russian history and previous Russian rulers, you have to understand where he came from and how he came to power in 1999. It's a story that takes us through the late communist era, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the chaos that followed in the 1990s. It's a story about Putin himself, who he is, how he thinks, what forces and ideas shaped his life, and how they brought him to that fateful day at the tail end of the 20th century. This is the story of Putin's rise to power. This video is not about current events, but it's plainly evident that Vladimir Putin and Russia are in the news literally every day. You just can't escape it. For example, I found this story on Ground News about American and Russian journalist Alsur Kumasheva, who a Russian court in Tatarstan recently sentenced to a prison term for reporting on the Russian military. Whatever she said about them, clearly Putin's regime didn't appreciate it. Ground News is a website and app that aggregates news stories from across the world and across the political spectrum. Let me show you how it works. On the website, we can see the story about Kumasheva has been covered by 133 sources. About half the sites covering it are from the left side of the political spectrum. Ground News shows you the political leaning of the sources covering the story. This feature, the bias distribution, is instrumental in showing how the story is playing across the media landscape. If you click on bias comparison, you'll see that on the left of the spectrum, the focus is on Kurmasheva's trial and verdict and how it's being condemned as politically motivated. What few sources on the right that are covering it take a broader approach, discussing implications for journalism in Russia in general. Ground News has a lot of other great features. I have a list of topics that I check all the time, and I found this great one under archaeology about how researchers have found a bunch of musket balls from the Battle of Concord in Massachusetts, one of the first battles of the Revolutionary War in 1775. I mean, how cool is that? I teach my middle school students about this battle. Now there's something in the news about it, and I wouldn't have found that without Ground News. Ground News is a great tool to help you understand the information that you consume and cut through the spin and disinformation that's so prevalent in our media environment. And it can be fun too. So if you go to ground.news/Munger right now, you can subscribe through my link for 40% off the Vantage plan, which is the plan I use every day. Or you can scan the QR code to get there. And for less than the cost of a coffee, you can stay informed and support my work at the same time. And now, back to Vladimir. Before we get into the substance of Putin's backstory, I want to say a few words about why this video was relevant and also why I did it the way I did. First and foremost, this is not a video about current events. It's not about the war in Ukraine, or Putin's repressions in Russia, or his assassinations of journalists, or anything else that has happened since his accession as Russian president on the last day of 1999. It's neither an attempt to condemn Putin nor to lionize him. It's an attempt to understand him. Despite Putin's immense ability to affect world events, very few people truly understand who he is, where he came from, what he wants, or what he's capable of. A lot of people have opinions about Putin, especially politicians or talking heads on TV or people on social media, and most of those opinions I've observed are not based on any deep study of the man. Even most biographical material about Putin tends to skate over the most important things in his background. Yes, he was a KGB agent, but do you know what that really means? Why he decided to become one? And what he did while he worked for them? Those are the kinds of important questions that I want to delve into here. You might want to know, how come the story in this video only goes up to the last day of 1999, the day that Putin took power in Russia? There are two reasons for that. First, the rest of the story is profiled in the course on my website. That'll take you both through Putin's background, but also his years in power since 2000. The course, which is available for $49.99 US, has a very different focus, much more big picture and analytical. This video is intended to stand alone. I made it to be self-contained, but if you can't get enough Putin in the 3 hours here, that course is available. The course was originally recorded a couple of years ago, before the invasion of the rest of Ukraine in early 2022. But there is a new chapter up now in the course dealing with everything that will bring you up to date. I have not had to change my historical judgments of Putin very much since I originally made the course. Second, I think Putin's rise to power is uniquely instructive in showing us who he is. After 2000, Putin has been able to exert a large amount of control over the narratives told about him, including about his own past, which he's fudged, shaded, or even outright lied about on numerous occasions. Before his accession to power, at the end of 1999, however, he could exert far less control over how the historical record portrays him. Thus, if you want to see the real Putin, I argue that you should study the Putin that existed before December 1999. Although this video is not an attempt to make Putin look bad, as Philip Short, one of Putin's biographers, whose book was a major source for this video, said, he's more than capable of demonizing himself without anyone else's help. There will invariably be someone out there who thinks that I'm going too easy on him and conclude that somehow I must be being paid by the Russians to make this video. Utter nonsense, of course. I'm not sure how you would look at the information I've got here about how Putin treated his wife in Chapter 7, or his role in the Leningrad food swindle of 1992, Chapter 10, or his relationship with the oligarchs, that's in Chapter 13. Anyway, I don't know how you look at that and then conclude that I'm some sort of Putin fanboy. If you think that, though, I'll say what I often say to critiques from the peanut gallery. No one's stopping you from turning this off and watching cat videos, of which there are millions on YouTube. One last thing, I do not speak Russian. I've done my best on the Russian names here, and I've tried to check their pronunciations as best I could, but without a background in the language, I guarantee that I've fallen short on a number of occasions. Problem with that? Well, you know where to go. Okay, let's start to get into the backstory. Remember the thesis of my class, though. The key to understanding Putin is seeing him in the context of Russian history and previous Russian rulers. And the thesis of this video, which is, before you can place Putin in that proper context of Russian history and previous Russian rulers, you have to understand where he came from and how he came to power in 1999. We're about to get into some deep Russian history now. In fact, to really understand where Putin came from and the forces that shaped his life, we have to start even before he was born, in the grim story of what happened to his birthplace, Leningrad, during World War II. Why is an event that occurred years before Putin was even alive critical to understanding him? The answer to that is in Chapter 2. On June 22, 1941, the armed forces of Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union in the massive operation known as Barbarossa, the largest surprise military invasion of the 20th century, probably of all time. German dictator Adolf Hitler had long hated the Soviet regime and coveted the natural resources, particularly food, that the Soviet Union controlled. Indeed, his plan to annex large parts of Russia, Ukraine, and other nearby countries to serve German needs was outlined in Mein Kampf, his manifesto written in the 1920s. The city of St. Petersburg, founded by Russian Tsar Peter the Great in the early 18th century, was the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. It was here that not only the revolt occurred that brought down the Romanov dynasty in March 1917, but also the coup by Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Party in November of that year that ultimately ushered in 74 years of Soviet rule. I discussed those events in my video on the fall of the monarchies. What you need to know here is that St. Petersburg, which was renamed Petrograd during World War I, was Russia's interface with the rest of Europe and its most cosmopolitan, modern, and liberal city. Moscow was the administrative heart of the Russian and Soviet states, but St. Petersburg was in many ways its cultural capital. After the Bolsheviks came to power, they renamed the city again, this time to Leningrad. Because of Leningrad's cultural, political, and economic importance to Russia and the Soviet regime, Hitler wanted to destroy it utterly. Nazi plans for the city called for it to be totally erased, every brick, every house, every street. One of the three main army divisions that comprised Operation Barbarossa was aimed at destroying Leningrad. However, this proved considerably more difficult in reality than on paper. The Germans moved in tandem with military forces of Finland, one of Germany's allies, which had fought a war against the Soviet Union in the winter of 1939 and 1940. The idea was to form a circle of German and Finnish forces around Leningrad, cut it off from all supplies, and starve it into surrender. They expected it would take a couple of weeks. It didn't work out that way. The Nazis expected the city to surrender in early September. The city was surrounded, but the Finns proved less reliable allies than the Germans had hoped. Their participation in the operation was less than enthusiastic. Nevertheless, hundreds of thousands of Russian civilians were stuck inside the city, with dwindling food and supplies, enduring constant bombardment from German planes and land artillery. There had been massive efforts to evacuate people from the city, but the evacuations were incomplete. The only supplies that could reach Leningrad came across an ice road over this lake called Lake Ladoga. Other than that, the Leningraders had to do the best they could under the worst conditions anyone could imagine. Far from surrendering quickly, Leningrad remained under siege for more than 800 days, from the late summer of 1941 to January 1944. So what does any of this have to do with Putin? Well, Putin's mother, Maria Ivanovna Shalomova Putin, was living in a place called Peterhof, 20 miles west of Leningrad, when the Nazis advanced at the end of August 1941. One of her brothers brought her to Leningrad to stay with relatives. Bad idea, as it turned out. She was one of the civilians trapped under the German siege. Maria also had with her her baby son, Victor, born the previous year, 1940. Maria's husband was Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin. He was absent from Leningrad at the start of the siege. Vladimir Putin, the father, is believed to have worked for the NKVD, the Soviet secret police in the Stalin era. He worked on a destruction battalion whose job was to sabotage infrastructure behind the Nazi lines. He was apparently wounded doing this in early 1942 and returned to his wife in Leningrad. This was absolutely the worst time of the siege. The death and suffering of the people in Leningrad during this period is almost unimaginable. People ate wallpaper paste and sawdust. The streets were full of starving, exhausted people who sometimes dropped dead in mid-step. Others were trapped in houses, apartments, and basements, freezing with no fuel to keep them warm in one of the harshest winters of the 20th century. Tens of thousands of bodies went unburied because the effort of digging graves was physically impossible for those who might otherwise have done it, since there was no food and nearly everyone was hovering on the edge of starvation. A very famous story from the Siege of Leningrad involves a girl, Tanya Savicheva, who wrote a diary chronicling the deaths of every member of her family from disease or starvation. Savicheva lived here in this apartment building, which still exists today and shows no signs of the privations of the war years, but it did happen here. The deaths of the Savicheva family were so famous that Richard Nixon referenced Tanya's story in his speech accepting the 1972 Republican presidential nomination.
She wrote of the deaths of the members of her family. And finally, these were the last words in her diary. All are dead. Only Tanya is left.
Tanya herself survived the siege only to die of tuberculosis later in 1944 after having been evacuated at last from Leningrad. The Putins were one of many families of Leningrad who suffered similar fates. In March 1942, at the same time members of Tanya Savicheva's family were perishing of starvation, Viktor Putin, aged 2, died of diphtheria. He was the Putins' only surviving child at that time. Their first son, Albert, had died of whooping cough in infancy. The exact circumstances of Viktor Putin's death are disputed. Vladimir Putin has said that his brother was taken to an orphanage when his mother was too weak to carry on, or else that 2 young, unnamed women took the baby away for safekeeping and then he died in their care. We don't know. Philip Short, one of Putin's biographers, doubts both of these stories. All we know for sure is that Viktor Putin died in 1942. Although it happened more than a decade before Vladimir Putin's birth, the death of Viktor Putin during the Leningrad siege had a huge effect on the Putin family. Though it was a tragedy that they apparently rarely spoke of, the searing effect of the death on his parents shaped how they behaved in later life and how they raised their younger son. Furthermore, the experience of the siege, mass death and starvation, burned a sort of collective trauma into the consciousness of the people of Leningrad who survived it. Survival, doing anything to survive, however desperate or depraved, was part of their shared experience and the fabric of their civic life. The uniquely Leningrad-colored ethos of survival definitely found its way into Vladimir Putin's governance of Russia, and indeed the way he's lived his entire life. The trauma of the siege was even woven into Leningrad's physical environment. This is Piskarevskoye Memorial Cemetery in St. Petersburg. Over 400,000 victims of the siege were buried here. The process of cleanup after the siege, including the burying of bodies, literally took years. The cemetery is one of a multitude of memorials, statues, and remembrance sites of the siege and its victims. Viktor Putin was one of the hundreds of thousands who was buried here. Vladimir visited the cemetery many times with the knowledge that his brother was here, both in his childhood and private life, and even as leader of Russia. He famously visited the cemetery in 2001 with German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. If you need another example of how central the siege is to the consciousness of Leningraders, look at this. This stenciled sign, usually blue with white lettering, appears today on numerous buildings and walls in the city of Leningrad. It reads, "Citizens, during shelling, this side of the street is the most dangerous." During the siege, this warning was painted all over the city. After the war, it became a memorial slogan and virtually a meme, similar in some respects, though with a much deeper and more solemn meaning than the famous "Keep Calm and Carry On" slogan in Britain that also emerged from World War II. The siege and its remembrance are virtually baked in to the DNA of the people of Leningrad, even those who weren't alive when it happened. The point I'm making here is that it's impossible to understand Putin without knowing about this vitally important, perhaps the most important, event in the history of the city that he came from. The role of the Siege of Leningrad in Putin's life and character simply can't be overestimated. That's why I started the story of his life with it. The siege itself was eventually lifted after a Soviet army counterattack in January 1944. After suffering staggering losses, About 20 million Soviet citizens, the vast majority of them civilians, were killed in the Great Patriotic War, which is what the Russians call World War II. The Red Army made a resurgence in 1943 and 1944 and ultimately smashed Hitler's Germany from the east. That, combined with major attacks by Stalin's Western allies, spelled the end of the Nazi regime in 1945. Before we move on, I want to mention one other thing about Soviet history. And I'm putting it in this chapter because it doesn't really fit anywhere else, and I'd like to get it out there. As we'll see later on, the terms Russia and Soviet Union or USSR are not interchangeable. The Russian czars, going back to Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, and especially the Romanovs in the 17th century, gradually assembled a Russian-dominated empire across Eastern Europe and Asia. Russia, the ancestral land, was the center of this empire. But what was controlled by Russia at the height of the imperial period included a lot of other countries and regions that were not and are not culturally or historically Russian. Take, for example, the country of Ukraine, which developed from various interrelated regions that gradually came under Russian domination in the 17th century. After that happened, in the 19th century, Ukraine developed a nationalist movement, as many other people in Europe were doing at that time. In 1917, when the Tsars were overthrown, Ukraine immediately declared independence from Russia. It didn't stick, and for complex reasons, Ukraine became reabsorbed into the new Bolshevik Empire, which was officially reorganized into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1922. Ukraine was not the only country this sort of thing happened to. There were numerous others. The modern country of Moldova is another example that is much less often talked about. It used to be the province of Moldavia, closely associated with the historical land called Bessarabia, and also tried to exit the Russian Empire as it was cracking up during the 1917 revolutions. Like Ukraine, Moldavia also became a Soviet Socialist Republic, part of the communist-dominated USSR, though in a different and more roundabout way. Moldova was part of Romania, which was ceded, that part was ceded to the USSR in 1940, part of the complicated scrambling of European spheres of influence in the early days of World War II. Chechnya, which we'll get to, is sort of a special case, but it has some things in common with these sorts of countries. The point I'm making is that the Soviet Union, as it existed between 1922 and 1991, was a conglomerate of countries and regions, dominated by Russia, but not really a part of it. And there have been long-standing arguments, literally for centuries, about what essentially counts as Russia, or what counts as some other country distinct from Russia, or whether a country distinct enough from Russia to be significant should nevertheless belong to Russia. Now, remember this, it becomes important later. In fact, it's so important that for purposes of this video, I'm going to give this concept a name. We're going to call it, What is Russia? Okay, you're probably going crazy because we're a significant stretch into this video and the titular character hasn't even been born yet. Let's take care of that in the next chapter. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was born on October 7, 1952, at a maternity hospital in Leningrad, not far from where the Putins, Maria and Vladimir Spiridonovich, lived on Baskov Lane. The war was over, but much of Leningrad was still in ruins. Still, they tried to restart their family. Vladimir, the father, was now working at the Iagorov railway carriage works. He was a member of the Communist Party. Putin's grandfather, Spiridon, was still alive in 1952. He had a very interesting life. A chef by trade, he wound up being the personal chef of Lenin in the early days of the Bolshevik regime. Spiridon also cooked for Lenin's widow, Krupskaya, after Lenin's death in 1924, and he reportedly cooked for Stalin on occasion as well. Spiridon Putin died in December 1965. Vladimir Putin was born just barely in the reign of Joseph Stalin, the brutal Soviet dictator with whom he has often been compared. In 1952, Stalin's health was finally failing, and he spent most of his time holed up in a dacha called Kuntsevo, located in a forest outside of Moscow. A dacha in Russian culture is sort of a vacation home usually in the country. The concept comes up a lot in Putin's story, so you need to know it. Anyway, the story of Stalin's death is well known. He was found collapsed on the floor of his dacha on March 1st, 1953, in a puddle of his own pee. Whether his doctors or one of the grotesque toadies that surrounded him, like Beria or Malenkov, hastened Stalin's death or facilitated it or directly caused it, is a subject of debate that I'm not going to get into. Suffice it to say, Stalin died on March 5th, and the Soviet Union entered a very chaotic and uncertain period. Various leaders vied against each other for power. Nikita Khrushchev eventually came out on top, but it was not for 3 more years, until 1956, that Khrushchev or other high Communist Party members dared to start criticizing the awful things Stalin had done during his 30 bloody years in power. This was the uncertain Russia in which Vladimir Putin, known in his childhood as Volodya, grew up. What you're looking at is the courtyard of the apartment building where the Putin family lived at the time of his birth and throughout his childhood. It's kind of grimy even now, but it was much worse at that time. What you must understand is that most Soviet citizens in this period lived in fairly desperate poverty. The communist system simply couldn't provide the materials for a good standard of living. In this courtyard, there were vegetable gardens. Families, like Putin's, grew their own food to supplement the meager provisions that the government handed out: potatoes, butter, cabbage, and occasionally meat. In addition to these trees and the vegetable gardens, you should imagine this courtyard filled with trash, which was dumped here. The kids who grew up here, Putin's contemporaries, played among the piles of garbage. This was a slum, and in many ways, it still is. There was no central heating in this apartment building in the 1950s, only wood stoves. The family didn't have their own bathroom. Communal living was the rule for Soviet people in this period. As bad as it was, the Putins had it a little better than others. They had a telephone in their apartment, a rarity. And in the 1960s, they had a TV set, which was even more rare. Vladimir Putin, the father, was a factory foreman. Throughout his life, Putin has told stories of growing up here and especially of catching rats in the courtyard and the stairwell. Now you have to take everything Putin says about himself and his background with about a shaker and a half of salt, because he uses stories about his life, true or not, as a way to project the image of himself that he wants you to see. But in this case, I believe the rat stories. Putin's childhood friend, Viktor Borisenko, described the people he hung out with like this: quote, unshaven, dirty guys with port wine and cigarettes, booze, obscene language, fights. And Putin was in the midst of all these bums, end quote. In this environment, Putin unsurprisingly frequently got into fights with neighborhood kids. Fighting is a common theme in his life. It started here in an unstructured way, and then later in his childhood and adolescence, these instincts got channeled into a more structured study of martial arts. The sport that he got attracted to was called Sambo, which is a uniquely Russian version of martial arts developed by the Red Army in the 1920s to improve hand-to-hand combat techniques. This building is only a few doors down from the Putin's collective apartment. In the 1950s, it was school number 193, where young Vladimir Putin attended school. He was a terrible student, unruly and disruptive. An old teacher said of him, quote, he was very undisciplined. He lacked concentration. His studies hardly interested him at all. He didn't care what marks he got. It was of no importance to him, end quote. Putin's behavior was so bad that he was rejected for admission into the Pioneers, the communist youth organization that most Soviet kids joined in the 3rd grade. It was extremely unusual for a child to be refused entry, and even more so for behavior problems. The usual basis was bad grades. His weren't that good, but he wasn't flunking. At age 12, Putin's constant rages and fighting got him hauled before what was called a comrades' court, a sort of neighborhood tribunal. The court warned him to shape up or he'd be sent to reform school. He managed to avoid reform school. Putin and Borisenko joined a Sambo club run by a guy named Anatoly Raklin, who became a coach and mentor to Putin. His behavior began to improve, but he never lost his surly and combative personality. Not long after this, Putin was forced to make his first real life choice. He had 3 tracks that he could have followed. The kids who were incorrigible ne'er-do-wells typically became criminals and gang leaders. That was certainly the path that he was on. Or he could go to vocational school and end up on a factory assembly line. That was track 2. Track 3 was to shape up enough to join one of the communist youth organizations, which would offer him at least a ghost of a chance at going to college. Rare in the Soviet Union, but necessary to rise any higher in life than a common laborer, unless he wanted to join the military. Putin decided on track 3, and his grades and behavior improved just enough for him to squeak by. In 1965, he was finally admitted to the Pioneers, several years later than most of his contemporaries. But the move pleased his father, who was a devout party communist and believed wholeheartedly in the ideology of the state. Putin, the brawler from the trash-filled courtyard on Baskov Lane, finally had a chance to become something more than that. It's worth trying to understand the cultural world in which Vladimir Putin spent his youth. Having been born in 1952, Putin spent his adolescence in the 1960s and early adulthood in the early to mid-70s, which was a very strange time in the Soviet Union. If he was born in the United States, he would have fallen squarely in the baby boom generation. Other people you may have heard of who are Putin's contemporaries, born in the same year, 1952, include comedian Dan Aykroyd, horror author Clive Barker, the late actor and dancer Patrick Swayze, and former action movie star Steven Seagal, who now lives in Russia and who claims Putin as a close personal friend. But growing up in Russia during the same time the baby boomers were coming of age in the US was an entirely different thing. In his adolescence, Putin encountered the Soviet Union's booming counterculture, such as underground rock artists who cut albums on recycled X-ray films, and even political dissidents who published and circulated subversive writings, known as samizdat. Though the Soviet regime was always repressive, the 1960s and 70s were hardly the nightmare state of Stalinist times. The regime, now under the control of bland bureaucrat Leonid Brezhnev, sought to indoctrinate its people mainly through propaganda, rather than bullets or long sentences to the gulag. The gap between what the Communist Party said life was like in the Soviet Union and what it was really like was glaringly obvious to everyday people. These were the days when people stood in line for hours a day to get tickets to pick up basic essentials like shoes or toilet paper. A family could wait on a list for years to get an upgraded apartment or a new car. Yet, the Brezhnev regime insisted that the Soviet and Eastern Bloc economies were robust, producing more every year, and that problems like poverty, crime, and drugs only existed in Western capitalist societies. The Brezhnev years, known by some historians as the years of stagnation, were kind of a shadow play, where national leaders and bureaucrats lived in a fantasy world of voluminous production and official prosperity, while ordinary people lived in the grinding poverty of a system where central economic planning had mostly failed to provide for their needs. This was a highly cynical environment to grow up in. This is the village of Pustomirtsa, about 60 miles, 96 kilometers from St. Petersburg. The family had a small dacha near here, where Volodya Putin spent summers in the late 60s. The place was just a log cabin with a vegetable garden outside, very simple, very rustic. Putin spent a lot of time on camping trips with the pioneers and later the Komsomol in this area, around St. Petersburg and farther afield. He also visited the Crimea, which he apparently fell in love with, and also the Sochi area, which is not in the Crimea but still on the Black Sea coast. Some of Putin's actions later in life, such as his building of one of his major estates near Sochi and the siting of the 2014 Winter Olympics there, make more sense when you realize Putin had a connection to this part of the world going back to his childhood and adolescence. In his final year of middle school, Putin applied to what was called a key school. This was a new program introduced in the Soviet Union designed to attract top students to fields related to what we would today call STEM, science, mathematics, engineering, that sort of thing. The key school to which he applied specialized in chemistry. He was not very good in chemistry. It's hard to imagine Vladimir Putin the chemist, but he did do well in literature, history, and German. That last subject will prove significant. And as we'll see in a moment, he was attracted to at least the popular image of spycraft and espionage. As we know, by now, Putin was a member of the Komsomol, one of several communist youth organizations. This is as good a time as any to tackle the question of whether Putin is or ever was a dedicated ideological communist. The answer to that question is surprisingly hard for a couple of reasons. First, The Communist Party was, until 1990, the only legal political party in the USSR. And to get a good job or a decent career, basically you had to be a member of the party. It wasn't like other countries, where you had a choice to join a political party because you agree with what they stood for. There were millions of people in the Soviet Union who were members of the party, but were either indifferent to or actively disliked the ideology of communism. Boris Yeltsin was one of those. In his early years, particularly the KGB years, there are reports of Putin speaking well of and agreeing with the various positions of the Communist Party. Growing up, he did seem to believe that communism was at least a worthwhile goal. However imperfectly it was being applied in practice. Again, millions upon millions of Soviet citizens would have agreed with him on that. In some conversations in the 80s, Putin seemed to disbelieve the accounts of Stalin's terrible repressions 50 years earlier. That, too, is consistent with the belief of a lot of people in late communist Russia. It was clearly not because of any deeply held conviction that Stalin was unquestionably admirable and could do no wrong. I doubt Putin would deny today that Stalin killed hundreds of thousands in his purges and as many as 6 to 9 million people throughout his reign, though on the other hand, he probably wouldn't be too interested in talking about it either. But if you're looking for evidence that Putin was a dedicated ideological communist, and especially that if he ever was, that he's remained so since 1991, there simply isn't any evidence of it at all. You wouldn't find Putin in 1968, 1988, or 2018 staying up late poring over the writings of Marx, Engels, or Lenin. You wouldn't find him singing the praises of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a prescription for all that ails society. There's simply no evidence that Putin's belief in communism was anything more than skin deep at a time when upwardly mobile Soviet citizens were basically required to pretend fealty to the state ideology. I think it's fair to say that Putin was a communist, at least a passive one, during his youth and KGB years. But I also think it's fair to conclude that he was not one after about 1990, and certainly is not one today. I don't think this question's particularly important, but there are those out there who do. Ted Cruz, I'm looking at you. So that's why I'm spending some time talking about it. In 1968, when Putin was just about to turn 16, a highly influential film was broadcast on Soviet television. It was called The Shield and the Sword, about Soviet spies thwarting Nazis in the early days of World War II. Putin said in later life that this film was extremely influential for him. He said of the show, quote, "What amazed me most of all was how one man's effort could achieve what whole armies could not. One spy could decide the fate of thousands of people." End quote. A legend has grown up around Putin that he was inspired to join the KGB by Soviet spy movies and TV series. There was another show called 17 Moments of Spring about spies in World War II, to which this legend particularly attaches. However, that series, hugely popular, was not broadcast until 1973, when Putin was 21 and already headed toward a career in the KGB. Whatever his motivations, what we do know is that in 1968, Putin went to visit the KGB headquarters in Leningrad and asked what he had to do to become a spy. In actuality, the KGB did not accept volunteers, but the man there told him that to have a shot at being recruited, he should either serve in the military or go to university. Putin asked the man what he should study. He replied, "Join the law faculty," as what we in the US would probably call pre-law today. So, Putin set his mind toward this goal, which was a pretty lofty one for a student with his spotty record. It may well be true that Putin was inspired by The Shield and the Sword, but the KGB was trying hard to rehabilitate its public image in the Soviet Union during the late 60s or early 70s. The making of the films and TV shows was part of a PR push engineered by Yuri Andropov, who became head of the KGB in 1967 and would later be the leader of the USSR. Andropov hoped that a dashing and adventurous image of the legacy would attract talented young men to want to work for the KGB. In Putin's case, it definitely worked. Because the KGB was the stepping stone to all of Putin's later career, you could say, in this limited and indirect sense, that Andropov's initiative is one of the major historical reasons for how and why Putin came to be the leader of Russia. As tempting as it is to jump right to Putin's KGB career, we're not quite there yet. He decided in late 1968 to study law at university for the purpose of positioning himself for KGB recruitment, but he didn't actually put on an agent's uniform for another 7 years. So let's take a look at what happened during those 7 years, and especially who he met during that time, which turns out to be important. That's in the next chapter. This is St. Petersburg State University, called Leningrad State during the Soviet era, one of the most prestigious institutes of higher learning in Russia. It was originally founded in 1724, and some of its notable alumni include Vladimir Lenin, Ayn Rand, composer Igor Stravinsky, and Alexei Akimov, winner of the 2023 Nobel Prize for Physics. Vladimir Putin first attended Leningrad State in 1970. He was generally a good student, applied himself, and rarely drank or attended parties, not what you'd expect given his background in the trash-filled courtyard where he grew up. But in addition to his studies, he devoted significant time to martial arts. He still practiced sambo, but also took up judo. Well-known trivia fact about Putin is that he's the equivalent of what we would call a black belt in judo. Some of the lessons he learned in the sport, attack with surprise and overwhelming force, arguably informed some of his strategic thinking later in his career. But fortunately, we don't need to get into that. One of the questions about Putin's background is how he managed to get into Leningrad State in the first place. It was the Soviet equivalent of an Ivy League college, and Putin's grades and academic accomplishments weren't especially impressive. The obvious answer was that he was chosen, at least in part, on the basis of his athletic prowess, and also quotas. Most of Leningrad State's students were sons and daughters of intellectuals or party bureaucrats. However, to maintain the fiction that admissions reflected the Soviet Union's supposedly egalitarian society, a percentage of admissions were set aside for students from working-class families. But it certainly didn't hurt that in spring 1970 he was named a candidate master of sport, an honor in secondary school athletics. In his adult life, Putin has gone to considerable lengths to deny that he got into Leningrad State on the Soviet equivalent of an athletic scholarship. As with other questions in his background, we can't prove or disprove it, but the circumstantial evidence does suggest that athletics played a role. I'm at a loss to understand why the question bothers him. What's wrong with going to school on an athletic scholarship? But you will note that in chapter 13 we'll get into another flap that casts doubt on Putin's achievements as a scholar and intellectual, so maybe it's a sore spot with him. Anyway, back to Leningrad State. It's interesting that Putin chose to study law. In the United States, we're so used to thinking of the Soviet Union as a totalitarian society, and law being something of a sham in those kinds of societies. But in reality, at least in the 1970s, Soviet law was a highly developed, complex, and technical field of study. I find this subject interesting, as I used to be a lawyer. Obviously not in Russia, though. The underpinnings of law in a communist country are entirely different than they are in countries that develop out of English law, as most of the United States did, or the Napoleonic and French Revolution era traditions that are also common in the West. Much of our law in the West is based on protecting individual rights, including property. Naturally, that was not the case in the Soviet Union. The purpose of law was to maintain a system of social order for the benefit of the state, which in communist ideology was congruous with the benefit of the people as a whole. Crimes in our legal system are considered offenses against other persons or property. Let's say you steal my car, maybe the very same 1970s AMC Pacer that made an appearance in my Amway Tools Cult video. The law that holds you accountable for stealing my car is designed, at least in part, to assuage the grievance done to me as a citizen by you, and to get back my AMC Pacer, if possible. Same situation, except we're in the Soviet Union. You steal my car, not a Pacer, but perhaps a Moskvich 2140. There's a law against that, obviously, but stealing my car is a crime not so much against me, but against the order of society. The state has an interest in prosecuting you, not to protect my rights, but to act against the disruption of the public order that you caused by stealing my car. See the difference? Of course, if you happen to wreck my Moskvich after stealing it, I'd have to wait 7 years on the list to buy a replacement, but that's beside the point. Because the laws in the Soviet Union were rigid and generally applied without discretion, legal education was pretty much by rote. Law professors would lecture, students would copy down verbatim what they said, and then barf it back up to them on the exam. There was no Q&A, no Socratic method, no reasoning. It must have been stupefyingly boring. Putin did very much like the lectures of one of his professors, who was more thoughtful and interesting than the others. That professor, also head of the Department of Common Law in Socialist Economics, was a fellow named Anatoly Sobchak. Putin and Sobchak got to know each other quite well, though possibly it took a while. Sobchak, as you'll see, becomes vitally important to our story later on. In 1974, as he was nearing the end of his studies at Leningrad State, Putin received a note saying somewhat ominously that he would soon be contacted about his career prospects. The man who sent the message was Dmitry Gantsarov, a KGB colonel whose job was to vet the students at Leningrad State and pick which ones would be approached to apply to the KGB. Putin had done everything right. They told him in 1968 the KGB did not accept volunteers, but he'd gained exactly the right credentials to be attractive to them. Now, to be sure, this does not mean that Putin was among the best and the brightest of the law faculty students. In fact, the KGB deliberately rejected the ones that had too good grades or seemed to be too self-reliant. On the other hand, they didn't want the dregs of the bottom of the class either. An ideal candidate for KGB recruitment was the equivalent of about a B- or C student, capable but not an overachiever, reliable but not necessarily independent, and bland rather than attractive or glamorous. In other words, a perfect bureaucrat with middling ambitions. If you passed Vladimir Putin on the streets of Leningrad or in the halls of Leningrad State University, this is exactly what you would think about him. He was perfect for the KGB. On August 1st, 1975, not long after his graduation from the university, Vladimir Putin reported to work in this building in Leningrad known as the Big House. There was a brief induction ceremony for the new entrants, and then they got to work. Contrary to his hopes from years ago when watching The Shield and the Sword, Putin was not assigned to foreign intelligence, and he sure as hell wasn't going to be the Russian James Bond. He was assigned to a menial clerical job in the secretarial department at KGB headquarters. He was starting from scratch, and he would have to work his way up. One of the very few facts about Putin's background that is more well known than just about any other is that he was a KGB agent. But what does that really mean? When you say KGB agent, most of us form a picture in our heads that's informed primarily by pop culture, like Boris and Natasha from the Bullwinkle cartoons, or else movies and TV shows where KGB agents are the bad guys. Needless to say, these ideas are not good history. Getting a handle on what Putin actually did in the KGB means bypassing the pop culture representations. Sorry, no Boris and Natasha. The KGB was in reality a stifling and impenetrable bureaucracy. Communist regimes weren't good at a lot of things, but building infuriating bureaucracies definitely was something they did well. One of the first things Putin did was attend a school within the KGB called the 401 School. The purpose of this school was to train agents how to do surveillance. In reality, surveillance was a major part of what the KGB did, staking out a building or watching a person, following their comings and goings, listening to phone conversations, that sort of thing. It was incredibly boring. If you've ever seen the excellent German film, The Lives of Others, which admittedly portrays the East German Stasi, not the KGB, you'll know how this works in general. Instead of being James Bond out there foiling imperialist plots, agents would spend hours, days, weeks in a small room, sitting there doing nothing but listening on headphones, and generating reams and reams of paperwork. That was the reality of life in the KGB or other Eastern Bloc spy organizations. Putin got out of the 401 school in June 1976. What he did after that, he has consciously tried to obscure. What he actually did from 1976 to 79 was to work for a division of the KGB known as the 5th Department, also called the 5th Directorate. This department's job was to monitor prominent and possibly problematic Soviet citizens, athletes, sports figures, religious figures, artists, intellectuals, you know, the usual suspects that communist countries don't tend to like. One of the specific jobs that Putin had in this period was apparently to monitor an Orthodox church procession that occurred at Easter 1978. During this time, Putin finally got a girlfriend. He started dating a woman named Lyudmila Kmarina. She was a brother of a classmate Putin had at Leningrad State University. Now, don't get confused here. A totally different woman, also named Lyudmila, pops up a little bit later. In 1978 and 79, Putin spent some time in Moscow at a KGB training school called the Dzerzhinsky Higher School, named after Felix Dzerzhinsky, the fearsome founder of the Cheka, Lenin's secret police, the forerunner of the NKVD and the KGB. At this school, they finally trained him to do foreign intelligence of a sort, that is, interface with and monitor foreigners inside the Soviet Union. After this school, Putin returned to Leningrad and joined the First Department, or First Directorate, these bureaucratic names are infuriating, to do this sort of work. Putin was for a time engaged to his girlfriend, Lyudmila No. 1. However, sometime in 1979, even after he applied for a marriage license and bought a ring, he abruptly called off the engagement and broke up with Lyudmila. We have no idea why. It may be that Putin discovered something in Lyudmila's family background that he thought might jeopardize his KGB career. It could possibly have been that she might have had a Jewish ancestor. There was a great deal of what you might call casual anti-Semitism in the KGB and the Soviet state. In fact, the KGB refused to recruit as an agent anyone who had significant Jewish background in their family. Nevertheless, whatever it was, Putin kicked Lyudmila No. 1 to the curb, and that was that. It might be worth it to talk briefly about Putin's view of women. It was and is, to boil it down to two words, quite traditional. To him, women were and are subordinate and subservient, existing mainly to do traditional chores like cooking meals and such. In his childhood, at one point, Putin had 2 pet birds in a cage, but he refused to clean out the cage, insisting that it was woman's work. No sooner had he sent the first Lyudmila packing than another one appeared. In 1980, Putin met Lyudmila Shkrebneva, a flight attendant on Aeroflot, the Soviet national airline. She was at the time the girlfriend of one of Putin's friends, but she split up with him and started dating Putin. This was kind of an awkward match, because Lyudmila, No. 2, was much more assertive and independent than the traditional subservient role that Putin had in mind for women. Nevertheless, after a few months, she quit her airline job and eventually enrolled at Leningrad University, not to be confused with Leningrad State University, to be close to him. Putin lied to her about what his day job was. He didn't tell her he was in the KGB, but rather said he worked for the Leningrad police. Incredibly, for a year and a half, he continued lying to her until he finally admitted that yes, he was in fact a KGB agent. She felt betrayed, as if he couldn't trust her. Small wonder he didn't. Even after Lyudmila knew he worked for the KGB, he refused to tell her anything about his job. Putin doesn't even seem to have been too enthusiastic about the relationship. Then in 1983, he got word that he was about to receive further KGB training that would prepare him to be posted outside the Soviet Union. Married officers had preference for foreign postings because a wife was a sign of personal stability. Quite suddenly, Putin proposed to Lyudmila No. 2. They were married on July 28th, 1983. This is the countryside just outside the village of Yorlova, near Moscow. It's quite pretty, as you can see. Russia really is a stunningly beautiful country, but there are a couple of things hidden in these woods. It's rumored that there are mass graves near here, full of victims executed by the NKVD during Stalin's Great Purges in the late 1930s. There's also a secret KGB training compound somewhere in the woods, sometimes called the Red Banner Institute. Vladimir Putin spent a year there beginning in July 1984, which trained agents for foreign assignments. Because he spoke German, you recall I told you to remember that, Putin was put in charge of the German section. At Yorlova, the KGB agents also learned about the psychology of how to manipulate people. Case in point, one of the key texts was a very famous American book, Dale Carnegie's How to Make Friends and Influence People. I get in trouble in the comments every time I mention this book. It's come up 3 times now, in the Amway Tools cult video, in the Charles Manson video, and now Putin. But before you denounce me for including it here, you might just want to think about why pyramid scheme grifters, cult leaders, and communist spy agencies love this book so much. It might have something to do with, manipulating people? Gee, you think? Anyway, after a year or so of running around in the forest playing spy, the KGB wrote an evaluation of one Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, a document which has survived. It was not entirely complimentary. Though it found him satisfactory in performance, the report noted Putin was, quote, withdrawn and uncommunicative, and that he was pedantic, and that he had, quote, a lowered sense of danger. For example, the report noted that while visiting his wife in Leningrad, Putin got into a fight at a train station and wound up with a broken arm. Putin hoped to be sent on assignment to one of the important European capitals, Bonn, Vienna, or even Berlin. That did not happen, probably as a result of his middling evaluation statement. Instead, the word came that he was going to Dresden, a rather dreary city in East Germany. It wasn't exactly the front lines of foreign intelligence. All in all, the KGB had turned out to be a pretty disappointing career, quite different from what he dreamed of when he saw the Shield and the Sword movie back in 1968. But what choice did he have but to go to Dresden? In 1985, he packed up his wife and his new baby, a daughter named Maria, and moved them to Dresden. Putin didn't know it yet, but from there, he would be in a unique position to witness the downfall of the Soviet system. This house, located at number 4 Angelika Strasse in Dresden, was the office of the KGB in that city during the late Soviet period, and this is where Vladimir Putin worked every day, beginning in 1985. He apparently worked up there on the upper floor, so he may have looked out this window every day. Today, this building is a training center for teachers in the controversial Waldorf School of Education. Never mind what that is, it's not relevant to Putin's story. This unassuming building was strategically located. The district headquarters of the Stasi, East Germany's secret police, was only a few blocks away, and Putin and several of his KGB colleagues also lived near here. The park across the river used to conceal the barracks of a Soviet tank regiment. This area was the USSR's main compound in the city of Dresden. So what did Putin and his KGB pals actually do here? You might be surprised, but the answer seems to be not much. Putin was ostensibly a translator, but that was just a front. He appears to have belonged to a group called Line N. Their job was to identify East Germans or other foreigners who could be recruited as KGB agents and sent into West Germany to gather intelligence. Sounds exotic, right? Well, it wasn't. Potential recruits identified by Putin's section then had to be vetted by a bureau called the First Chief Directorate. Gotta love these names. But only a few out of 1,000 were ever investigated further than that. And even fewer still actually became agents. Thus, Putin was basically collecting dossiers on people, the vast majority of which the KGB threw away for one reason or another. It was busy work. One of Putin's co-workers, a man named Agartonov, said of their work in Dresden, quote, "If any American spy had penetrated the operational staff, he would have been incredibly surprised. The formidable KGB was wasting its time on trifles." End quote. Throughout the 5 years he worked for the KGB in Dresden, there is no evidence that Putin ever gathered any useful intelligence, ran an operation in the field, or interfered with any foreign intelligence operation. He never exposed a Western spy. He never stole a single document or recruited a single agent himself. He was a drone, a worker bee, and he had what we would today call a bullshit job. But still, inconsequential as it was, Putin's job had some perks. In the West, we think of East Germany as a grimy totalitarian nightmare, but the standard of living there in the late 80s was actually considerably higher than it was in the Soviet Union. Consumer goods were more available, and the Putins lived better in Dresden than they ever had in Leningrad. In 2011, there was a flap in the less reliable sector of the press, such as the Daily Mail, to the effect that the BND, the West German intelligence service, was spying on Putin while he was in Dresden, and their files supposedly disclosed that he frequently beat his wife and he had an illegitimate daughter by a mistress in Dresden. I looked into these allegations. It is true that a BND official released information on Putin's time in Dresden, and that information included disclosures from a woman, an informant for the West German intelligence agency, who claimed that she was a good friend of Lyudmila Putin. According to this source, Putin was a tyrant at home who frequently beat his wife. This source also stated that while Putin's wife was back in Leningrad during her pregnancy with their second daughter, he cheated on her with a girl named Doris Basig, the daughter of a Stasi official. Supposedly, the relationship didn't last long. A love child, though, is not mentioned, and it's a bit far-fetched. So I don't buy the illegitimate daughter bit. But still, this was pretty dangerous. Extramarital affairs were against KGB policy. Putin could have been fired and sent back to Russia. The woman could also have gotten her father in trouble because the Stasi had rules about this sort of thing too. It's clear that Putin didn't treat his wife very well. Domestic violence seems totally in line with his personality, and he probably did have occasional affairs. Ludmila returned to Dresden later in the summer of 1985 and had their second baby there. Putin's time in Dresden coincided with the administration of Mikhail Gorbachev as Soviet leader. Though he pretended to be a doctrinaire apparatchik when he first came to power in March 1985, Gorbachev, a generation younger than the past few ancient and decrepit Soviet leaders, was at least smart enough to know that some sort of reform within the Soviet system, especially economic reform, was necessary. This is what terrified communist hardliners. Any hint of reform they feared would tear down the whole Eastern Bloc. It turned out the hardliners were right about that. The horrendous Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurred in April 1986. Observers in the West didn't appreciate at the time just how much this event strained the already failing Soviet economy and political system. Chernobyl, historians now argue, was a highly significant milestone on the road to the dissolution of Soviet-style communism. By 1987, Gorbachev was pursuing two parallel tracks. One was called Perestroika, which was domestic restructuring of the Soviet economy, which included loosening up controls on private business and other ideologically based economic rules. The second was Glasnost, a lessening of Cold War tensions by negotiating in more or less good faith with the West. This initiative led to Gorbachev's generally positive interactions with U.S. President Ronald Reagan, with whom Gorbachev signed the INF, or Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, at the end of 1987. Putin was generally enthusiastic about these changes. Keep in mind that he was never overtly political in this period, but from all accounts he supported the new regime's efforts to make the Soviet bloc a slightly less hellish place for ordinary people to live in. The East German leadership, however, was terrified. They saw Gorbachev's reforms as a wholesale abandonment of them, and they, like longtime East German leader Erich Honecker, feared their own heads might be on the block if the reform project got out of control. Gorbachev had another problem, which overrode almost all others. He and the Soviet Union were running out of money. In the mid-80s, the Soviet Union had finally come online as a major global oil producer. But when cheap Russian oil flooded the market, the price of oil crashed. That ultimately led indirectly to various other disasters, such as Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. But it meant in the short term that the Soviet economy was floundering. The war in Afghanistan, going on since 1979, was a huge drain in money and resources. Add Chernobyl to that, and by the end of the 80s, you can see why Gorbachev didn't want to prop up the old Eastern European communist buffer states anymore. He simply couldn't afford it. He basically announced this, though not in so many words, at a speech to the United Nations in December 1988, which reformists in Eastern Europe interpreted correctly as a statement that the USSR would not use force to hang on to its satellites anymore. That, perhaps more than anything else, opened the floodgates. In August 1989, about the same time free elections in Poland brought non-communist Lech Walesa to power, the government of Hungary decided to allow its people to visit neighboring Austria. They even took down the electric fence along the Hungarian-Austrian border. Because East Germans could visit Hungary now without travel visas, and they could now go from Hungary to Austria and from Austria to West Germany freely, what this meant is that thousands of East Germans suddenly started taking quote-unquote vacations to Hungary in the late summer of 1989. Within a few weeks, the surge of people leaving East Germany was a flood. In a panic, the East German government begged Gorbachev to do something to intervene. He refused. As anti-government demonstrations in East Germany surged, Gorbachev ordered the 500,000 Soviet troops in the country to remain in their barracks. He wouldn't lift a finger to stop what was happening. As you probably know, this led to one of the most dramatic moments of the 20th century, the dismantling of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not the first nor the most important act in the fall of Soviet communism, but it certainly was the most photogenic. In Dresden, Putin, who as you recall was just a busy bee drone worker anyway, just watched it all happen. On December 4th, 1989, after the East German government fell and reunification with West Germany was now officially on the drawing board, a group of East Germans marched on the Stasi headquarters just across the river from the KGB HQ where Putin worked. They stormed the place, and the Stasi was shortly after disbanded. Putin claimed that a group of demonstrators also tried to storm the KGB building, but he, Putin, personally pleaded with them to go away and then asked for some help from the Soviet tank regiment stationed nearby, who sent a couple of guards. This story sounds fishy. One of the demonstrators who was there said there were no more than 30 people who showed up at KGB headquarters, and it wasn't much of a showdown. Putin may not have been involved at all. What we do know is that Putin didn't remain in Dresden for long after the wall came down. On February 3, 1990, Putin and his family left Dresden to return to St. Petersburg. KGB had quite suddenly reassigned him. We're not sure exactly why, but there is a leading theory, and it makes perfect sense. I'll tell you what that is in the next chapter. This man is named Anatoly Sobchak, and he's vitally important to the Putin story. He came up earlier. You may remember that he was well liked as one of the few professors of law at Leningrad State University that wasn't just a droning robot. Sobchak undoubtedly met Putin, then a student, shortly after Putin came to school there in 1970. It's not known if they had any contact between the time Putin left school and when the KGB posted him to St. Petersburg in 1990, but that prior relationship is significant. Sobchak was something of a free thinker, and students may have liked his law lectures because he was less afraid than most professors of criticizing the government and the Soviet system. In 1988, as part of his reforms, Gorbachev overhauled the political machinery in the USSR, sort of retrofitting the old Supreme Soviet into a new body called the Congress of People's Deputies, for which there would be competitive elections, something new in the Soviet Union. This was before the Communist Party gave up its monopoly on power. That came later. Most of the people running for seats in the Congress of People's Deputies were members of the Communist Party. Organized political parties other than that one were still banned, but independent candidates were allowed to run. Anatoly Sobchak was one of those. He won a seat in the spring of 1989, just before the satellite states fell. Sobchak helped to found a committee called the Inter-Regional Deputies Group within the Congress of People's Deputies. Boris Yeltsin, the Moscow party secretary, was also a member. Essentially, this group was the democratic opposition to the Communist Party in the new Congress of People's Deputies. The KGB was not super happy with Anatoly Sobchak. He had led an investigation into an incident that occurred in spring 1989 when the KGB cracked down on protests in Tbilisi, the capital of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Georgia. Sobchak even rebuked the KGB chief on the floor of the Congress. Consequently, they wanted to keep tabs on it because that's, of course, what the KGB did. The idea was that they would find an agent who had some past connection to Sobchak and could insinuate himself back into his orbit and report back to the KGB on what he was doing. You can see where this is going, I hope. Putin was selected as the perfect guy to do that. This is why he was transferred from Dresden back to Leningrad to spy on Anatoly Sobchak. Officially, Putin was being appointed assistant to the vice rector of international affairs at Leningrad University, but he seems to have still been working for the KGB, funneling them dope on Sobchak. This was, however, a two-way street. Sobchak knew that Putin was a KGB agent, and he undoubtedly knew that his job was probably to spy on him. He didn't care. In fact, he wanted Putin around, probably because he thought he could use him as a pipeline to useful info that the KGB had that might prove to be to Sobchak's political advantage. In other words, he was happy to use Putin, and Putin was quite happy to be used. This kind of arrangement is so typical of how Russian intrigue works. So, Putin became Sobchak's chief assistant. However, Putin's official position wasn't entirely irrelevant. The job of the Office of International Affairs at Leningrad University was to evaluate requests by international exchange students to come study in the Soviet Union. Effectively, this office controlled which foreign students were admitted to the entire country, not just to Leningrad University. But this office overstepped those bounds, probably as a means to collect bribes. The Soviet Union was in economic freefall in 1990, and everybody needed money. Putin's boss made a deal with an American company, Procter & Gamble, to establish a joint venture in the USSR. In exchange for a fee, Procter & Gamble would get office space and access to some Leningrad movers and shakers who might help its business. Putin may not have been involved in this deal directly, but it was his first taste of dealing with Western companies who wanted to do business in Russia. I said a moment ago that the Congress of Deputies was established before the Communist Party gave up its monopoly on power. Well, in early 1990, that monopoly was abolished. And the fact that opposition parties were now suddenly legal put Anatoly Sobchak at the forefront of national politics. He even tried to challenge Gorbachev as national leader, but that was a super long shot. Sobchak had been a law professor for most of his career and only recently became a politician. But he was hot within the opposition to Gorbachev, no doubt about that. An office that turned out to be within Sobchak's reach was election to Leningrad City Council, called the Len Soviet. Sobchak originally wasn't a candidate, but 3 political factions fighting within the Len Soviet had ground it to a halt, so the Leningrad city politicians thought maybe bringing in an outsider to lead the body might help them break the deadlock. Sobchak was perfect. On May 23, 1990, Sobchak became chairman of the Len Soviet. Leningrad did not have a popularly elected mayor. This position was at this time about the closest thing there was to it. Putin's job, once he was firmly attached as Sobchak's main assistant, was an extension of that Procter & Gamble deal. He was to court foreign businesses and encourage them to invest and do business in Leningrad to build up the city's economy and tax base. This kind of thing was only just becoming legal in the late Soviet period, but Sobchak and Putin realized how important it was going to be. If Leningrad had its own business-oriented economy with a lot of foreign capital invested, the city would be less susceptible to control by Moscow or the national leaders. That was Sobchak's vision. While working at this job, Putin came in contact with a capable young bureaucrat named Dmitry Medvedev. He also had been a student at Leningrad State University, though not at the same time as Putin, and he eventually taught law there, just as Sobchak did. Medvedev ran Sobchak's 1989 campaign for the Congress of Deputies. Now, I'm not going to talk about Medvedev anymore in this video, but how he came to know Putin is important. Medvedev, of course, later became the figurehead president of Russia between 2008 and 2012, when Putin was term limited. During that time, Medvedev was just a puppet of Putin. By the end of 1990, national politics in the Soviet Union had become a total mess. The system was beginning to implode, but hadn't disintegrated yet. The Communist Party was losing its grip on power, but not entirely. An opposition headed by people like Boris Yeltsin and Anatoly Sobchak was becoming influential, but not yet ready to take over. The next year, though, proved to be the fateful one, both for the dying Soviet Union and for Putin himself. That year, 1991, gets its own dedicated chapter, and it's the next one up. Gorbachev had signaled at the end of 1988 that he was unwilling to use force to keep the Eastern European buffer states from leaving the Soviet orbit. However, that did not apply to countries within the Soviet Union itself. The 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, who had been annexed illegally into the Soviet Empire by Stalin in 1940, were during 1990 understandably eager to assert their independence. Gorbachev intended to prevent this to the extent he could. On January 13, 1991, a series of demonstrations in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius finally provoked him into a military response. 14 people were killed in the Soviet military crackdown. Much of the world was surprised. Wasn't Gorbachev supposed to be a good guy now? But this had to do with that whole "what is Russia" question that I said early on would be important. What happened in Vilnius rippled outward through the rest of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin was the president of the Russian Republic, the largest constituent member of the USSR, but in July 1990 he had quit the Communist Party. He supported the Baltic Republic's moves toward independence and condemned the crackdown. Sobchak and the Len Soviet were also on Yeltsin's side. Gorbachev was losing control. There was political upheaval going on in Leningrad too. A long series of disputes about the shape of the city government finally ended in a compromise that was to Sobchak's advantage. In June, there would be a citywide election for a mayor who would head the city government. Sobchak was already kind of like the mayor of Leningrad, but after June 12, 1991, when he won that election, he was now officially its mayor. At that same time, the city voters also elected to restore the city's old name, St. Petersburg. But on the national level, something had to be done about the fracturing Soviet Union. Gorbachev attempted a political compromise. A document called the Union Treaty would technically keep the USSR together, but also provide for autonomous powers for the constituent republics. It was a reorganization of the USSR meant to split the difference between those republics that wanted independence and those people in the central government who wanted to keep the old communist union together as much as practicable. The Union Treaty was concluded on July 23, 1991. It was scheduled to go into effect on August 20th. For the hardline communists still in the government, the treaty was utterly terrifying. They decided they would have to take drastic measures to scrap it, and hopefully to wipe the slate clean from the chaos that Gorbachev had brought and instead restore the old USSR the way it used to be. This was the genesis of the coup of August 1991. The main organizer of it was Vladimir Krichkov, head of the KGB, but he assembled several other cronies, some the heads of various Soviet government departments. Gorbachev was supposed to go on vacation at his dacha just before returning for the Union Treaty ceremony. The plotters decided this was the time to strike. This is called the Coronation Spit. It's a narrow strip of land connecting Lithuania to the area around Kaliningrad, which is Russian territory, and it's a popular vacation destination. On August 19, 1991, Putin and his family were staying at a borrowed guest house somewhere in this area when he heard the announcement on TV that a special committee had taken power in Moscow and Gorbachev had supposedly resigned for health reasons. Putin understood, as almost everybody did, that a coup by the hardliners was in progress. At first, he wasn't sure what to do. Knowing what you already know about Vladimir Putin, you can imagine that he would evaluate this situation and try to figure out which side of it to be on, depending on what he thought the outcome was likely to be. That's exactly what he did. The coup, however, was botched from the beginning. One of the plotters, Gennady Yanayev, gave a press conference insisting this committee was in charge, but his hands were visibly shaking during the conference. Putin noticed this and, according to at least his own account, realized then and there that the coup was doomed to fail. The same day, August 19th, Putin was able to reach Sobchak on the telephone, and his boss told him to come back to Leningrad, St. Petersburg. The next morning, August 20th, he was there at Sobchak's side. Putin claims that he organized a contingent of bodyguards to protect Sobchak from possible arrest by allies of the committee, but this is probably not true. The hardliners' coup was so incompetent, it'd be laughable if the stakes weren't so high, and if 3 people hadn't been killed in the streets of Moscow. The plotters failed to take full control of the broadcast media. They had it in Moscow, but in places like St. Petersburg, their opponents, including Sobchak, were able to go on the air to rally popular support against them. Another mistake the plotters made was to leave Gorbachev alive. Though not many people were listening to him by this point, he did manage to smuggle out a statement on videotape. The most egregious of their failures was not to arrest Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin had some public cachet for standing up to Gorbachev, but his appearance standing on a tank in Moscow, urging the people to resist, resulted in a subtle but vitally important shift. The legitimacy of power in the Soviet Union passed from Gorbachev to him. The military did not obey the hardliners' orders. The crews manning the tanks in Moscow basically hung around, drinking or fraternizing with local people who gathered around them, the same people the hardliners wanted them to shoot. With the military taking a big nope on the coup, police followed suit. Officials of the Russian Republic ordered the arrest of the plotters. One of them, Valentin Pavlov, had spent most of the 3 days of the coup completely drunk and was found at his dacha quite ill. Another, Boris Pugo, former interior minister, shot himself rather than be taken alive. His wife also died, though whether she also committed suicide or her husband shot her is unclear. The failed coup supercharged the final collapse of the Soviet Union. After the event, the idea of the Union Treaty was dead. Republics were now bolting for the exit like people running away from a stink bomb. Estonia didn't even wait until the coup was over to declare independence, which they did on August 20th, while the plotters were still nominally in charge. Latvia followed the next day. On August 24th, 1991, the most important of the declarations, at least for purposes of Putin's story, came down. On that day, the Republic of Ukraine adopted a declaration of independence. Ukraine had tried to leave the Russian Empire again at the earliest possible moment during the 1917 Russian Revolution, but it didn't stick. This time, it did. This event, Ukraine's independence, was what Putin would try to reverse by force of arms in February 2022. Again, this implicates the "what is Russia" question. Gorbachev couldn't stop any of it. As the Soviet Union spun apart, he was left with less and less to actually do. The republics, including Russia, of which Yeltsin was president, were now autonomous, and one by one, the functions of the old Soviet government were superseded by the powers and functions of the republics. Yeltsin himself delivered the coup de grace. In early December, he and several other leaders of the former Soviet republics met at a dacha in a forest in Belarus and quickly signed an agreement that dissolved the USSR and created a much more nebulous entity called the Commonwealth of Independent States. This was a calculated move to suck away what remained of Gorbachev's power, leaving Yeltsin the most powerful head of state in what used to be the Soviet Empire. On Christmas 1991, Gorbachev, with no one returning his calls and nothing left to do but sit around in his office playing with paperclips, resigned. That night, the Soviet Union and the whole 74-year Bolshevik experiment in Russia came to an end as the red flag came down for the last time. In St. Petersburg, though, no one had much time to make a big deal out of this, least of all Putin, who was working 18-hour days. One of the problems left behind by the dissolution of the Soviet Union was that the state's infrastructure for distributing food was no longer functioning. There was going to be a huge food shortage in St. Petersburg in the upcoming winter, which everyone expected to be really severe. Basic goods had already been rationed for almost a year. Shelves were bare and nobody had ration tickets left. It's hard to imagine people in Europe, in a country that had nuclear weapons and space flight technology, literally starving to death over the winter. But that was the potential situation in December 1991. Sobchak, as mayor, had to do something to feed the people of the city he governed so that they wouldn't riot. Not surprisingly, he turned to Putin, who already had a reputation as a fixer who could get things done, especially if you didn't want to know the details. Well, Putin made a deal, all right. What followed was the most politically serious misstep in Putin's entire early career up until the time he became president of Russia. It's important enough that I thought it should be broken out into a separate chapter, which is next. The St. Petersburg food scandal of 1992 is an infamous episode in Putin's rise to power, mainly because it almost single-handedly ended it. Had the political fallout been just a little bit worse, the whole course of global history since 1999 might be different. Just so you know, those are the stakes we're dealing with here, and why it's worth it to get into the weeds on this one. I mentioned in the last chapter that St. Petersburg and other Russian population centers were suffering from a severe food crisis in late 1991 and early 92. The way food worked under the Soviet system was that the bread baskets of the country, Ukraine was the most important, gave their produce to the state, which then went around distributing it to the populace. That made sense under their communist ideology. Incidentally, this is also part of how Stalin won World War II. During the war, everyone had to work for the war effort, and if they didn't receive food. As a result, virtually every able-bodied person in the Soviet Union really put their backs into the war effort, whether they were farming, fighting, or building trucks and tractors, because the alternative was, well, they'd starve. Post-December 1991, the whole food distribution system was now shut off. It wasn't that there was not enough food in the former Soviet Union, but it was that it couldn't get to the places where it needed to be distributed, especially urban areas, which is why Leningrad was particularly vulnerable. Just as they had in wartime, many people started growing their own food in their backyards, like the Putin family themselves had done in the courtyard in the 1950s. What they could grow in individual or community gardens couldn't replace the food they got from the state, but it would help. Remember that. It becomes important later. Putin, charged with a task by Sobchak of getting a whole bunch of chow unloaded onto St. Petersburg's docks before the populace starved and rioted, understood that the only real way to do it would be to get food from outside the country. He was the guy to do it because he was, by this time, chairman of St. Petersburg's Foreign Relations Committee, and he already had experience working with foreign companies. There was no cash in St. Petersburg, so they couldn't just buy food. What Putin could potentially trade for food was raw materials, machinery and equipment, much of it looted from the Soviet military or other arms of the now dissolved Soviet state. We're talking timber, concrete, copper, fuel oil, scrap metal, that sort of thing, which Putin hoped he could swap for potatoes, sugar, meat, dried milk, butter, baby formula, and feed for livestock. No one was left at the national level to facilitate foreign trade. Putin got together several, quote, import-export companies, with whom he, as chief of the Foreign Relations Committee, signed licensing agreements to trade all this stuff for the food. The deal was worth the equivalent of 122 million US dollars for enough food, hopefully, to get the city through the winter, or at least until the economy stabilized, or the national government of Russia could get some kind of food distribution network in place to replace the old Soviet one that was no longer working. The raw materials, the copper, concrete, wood, and such, went out of St. Petersburg. But very little, if any, of the food that these companies supposedly contracted for actually arrived. The import-export companies simply took the raw materials and sold them on the open market and didn't fulfill the other end of the bargain. Furthermore, the deals these companies made specified that they could take big commissions, in some cases between 25 and 50%. In other words, it was a huge swindle. It gets worse. Some of the import-export companies were owned by Putin's friends and associates, such as the brother of one of Putin's old law school friends. It certainly looked like Putin had arranged the whole thing to provide kickbacks and cushy profits to his friends, while people's bellies rumbled back home in St. Petersburg. Is that a fair reading of the situation? Well, the historical record, unfortunately, is unclear. Apparently, the contracts were incompetently written. Philip Short, Putin's biographer and a major source of this video, said, quote, a high school student could have done better. For example, of 13 contracts, 8 had no language at all about penalties if the import-export company failed to deliver the food. Of those that did specify some kind of penalty, legally they were probably unenforceable. In 1992, no one in Russia knew what laws applied to anything. In Putin's defense, the fact that a lot of his acquaintances and cronies were involved may not necessarily indicate that the whole thing was an attempt to line their pockets. In the absence of state channels and procedures, which was very much the situation in 1991 and 92 in Russia, informal networks of friends and acquaintances were kind of the only way to get things done. The charitable reading of the situation is that everything was in chaos legally and economically, and Putin turned to the only people he knew who might have a ghost of a chance of helping him. And he was willing to cut corners on even the bare hope that the deal could prevent St. Petersburg from going hungry. Then he got swindled by those unscrupulous import-export guys. In other words, his own friends and acquaintances betrayed him. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the interpretation that Putin arranged the whole thing or acquiesced in it, knowing the food would never arrive. But at least his friends would be happy, and he would have made some valuable contacts with the West that he could use in the future. Under this interpretation, he either knew ahead of time or didn't care if the import-export guys swindled the city. Which is correct? Well, I don't know, and it may not be a zero-sum game. The truth may lie somewhere between those two poles. But consider this. Even to this day, 30 years later, no one knows who actually supplied the raw material. The timber, metals, concrete, that sort of thing. The records have all been lost. And if friends, acquaintances, and valuable business associates swindled Putin, And, assuming he was on the up and up, trying to do what was best for St. Petersburg, he'd never trust them again. They'd be burning their bridges with him and forfeiting the opportunity to make immense future profits from the bargain basement flea market that Russia had become. Plus, we're talking about Vladimir Putin here. I think we're safe in discerning at least some nefarious motives behind the deal, though I stress again, the historical record isn't clear. The botched food deal blew up into a scandal. The St. Petersburg city government opened an investigation and recommended to Sobchak that he fire Putin and another city official called Anakin. Anakin was eventually fired, but Sobchak refused to sack Putin. Notably, the person who led the charge on the investigation was Marina Salya, chair of the Leningrad City Council on Food Supplies. She was a leader in one of the factions in the Lena Soviet who had deadlocked the body, which led to Sobchak being elected chair in the first place. In other words, she was a political enemy of Sobchak. Almost a year before the smelly Leningrad food swindle in May of 1991, Salya had gone to Berlin to try to get some meat and potatoes imported to the city. When she got there, she found that Putin had already made a deal and cut her out of the process. She determined also that the food in this deal was shipped not to Leningrad, but to Moscow. So, even before the 1992 deal that attracted all the attention, there is evidence that Putin had done this sort of thing before. Did Marina Salya make a big deal of the scandal as a political weapon against her enemy Sobchak? Yes, probably. But that doesn't mean that Putin didn't do what she accused him of doing. He probably did. But thanks to Sobchak, who in any event would have been motivated to resist a political attack by Marina Salya, Putin survived. They definitely did some backpedaling, though. Sobchak and Putin quickly negotiated a loan of $500 million from several banks in Spain, which was specifically earmarked for the purchase of food products, which did, in this case, arrive. Also, the winter didn't turn out to be as severe as everyone had foreseen, and those home vegetable gardens also filled a little bit of the demand. St. Petersburg neither starved nor rioted, and Putin kept his job. Nevertheless, before Putin had various episodes in his time as president of Russia with which to build the case for his ruthlessness and cruelty, the St. Petersburg food scandal of 1992 was usually Exhibit A in the quiver of charges that Putin was a monster. Stealing food from the starving people of St. Petersburg is a pretty low thing to do. Let's move on to Putin's role in the St. Petersburg city government during the early 90s. As you'll see, it laid the groundwork for his eventual rise to national-level power in Russia. It wouldn't be accurate to say that Vladimir Putin was the most powerful man in St. Petersburg in 1992. He wasn't. But you could make a case that he was the most strategic, the guy who had the best and most useful contacts, and who in fact held the future of the city and possibly all of Russia in his hands. At the beginning of 1992, Putin was 39 years old, a city bureaucrat in a badly fitted suit. You could never have dreamed that this guy would eventually become one of the most powerful men in the world. Here's why Putin was so important behind the scenes in this period. The Soviet Union was dead. Yeltsin's policy as president of Russia was to transition his country to a market economy on a crash basis as quickly as possible. That was always going to be painful and chaotic. Russia had gone from a place where private property had been mostly outlawed for the majority of the previous century to a capitalist country where there was very little to build on economically. Furthermore, Russia was broke. Think about this from Putin's point of view. St. Petersburg needed an economic basis fast. There was no money within Russia itself to build that. And the West was providing no foreign aid. George Bush I, the US president, was politically vulnerable in 1992 and didn't want to be seen as being soft on the former communist enemy. So Putin was unlikely to shake any rubles out of him. Thus, foreign investment from private companies outside Russia was really the only option, just as it had been in the food situation. Russia had a lot to offer foreign investors in 1992. It was the Wild East. There were millions of acres of former Soviet-owned real estate up for grabs, lots of raw materials, scrap metal, timber, oil, natural gas, all kinds of stuff that various people and entities in Russia were eager to sell on the cheap to make whatever cash they could to keep food in their their families' mouths. Russia was essentially up for auction. Vladimir Putin was one of the auctioneers. Under St. Petersburg city law, any foreign business interests that wanted to do business in the city had to register with Putin's office. It was advantageous for them to go through him anyway. Think about it. Say you're a bank from France and you want to open up operations in St. Petersburg. You send one of your execs to the city, and one of the first people you meet is this nice man, Vladimir Putin. There's nothing sinister about him at this time. Remember, he looks like an insurance salesman. And he says, "Oh, you're opening a bank? Well, you should definitely talk to this person and that person. I can introduce you. How's Tuesday at 2?" Now Putin has you and your French bank in his Rolodex, along with literally every other foreign business entity that's trying to do business in St. Petersburg. Putin could put you together with potential customers, perhaps somewhat shady Russian quote-unquote businessmen who need to stash large amounts of cash with no questions asked. He can also steer big real estate transactions your way, or international deals involving oil and natural gas, former Soviet military equipment, whatever you want. You might come to like Mr. Putin very much. You'll want to do him favors, like take him and his wife to dinner, send them Christmas cards, or send a bottle of Stoli over to his office on his birthday with your boss's compliments. You might even invite him to hang out with you in Provence on holiday. And you are just one card in Putin's Rolodex. He's got thousands of them. He knows everybody. Such a nice man. See how this works? Furthermore, Putin's reach is not just citywide or even regional, it's national. St. Petersburg is, and has been since the 18th century, the traditional portal through which Europe and the rest of the world does business with Russia. Putin's Rolodex is not just a directory of foreign firms and contacts doing business in St. Petersburg. It's basically a database of the vast majority of foreign business activity in Russia as a whole. So if you're in Moscow, in the administration of Boris Yeltsin, it behooves you to know Mr. Putin too. In addition to facilitating foreign trade, Sobchak relied on Putin for many other things. After the Communist Party was abolished, suddenly a bunch of property that it used to control in St. Petersburg was up for grabs. Office space, hotels, a farm, official party cars, even a summer camp for kids. Putin was in charge of liquidating all that property for cash. That gave him personal access to investors with money to buy this stuff, of which there were few in Russia at that time. Sobchak also told Putin to get illegal gambling in St. Petersburg under control. In 1992, makeshift casinos and slot machines were popping up all over the city like zits on a teenager's face. Trying to control them in a city with limited police budget and which was overwhelmed by street crime anyway meant coming in contact with the people who ran gambling operations. In other words, organized crime. In truth, it wasn't that organized in St. Petersburg in 1992, but Putin quickly began to know all the major criminals in the city. In Russia, there was a fine line between crime and more or less legitimate business, and especially in the early years after the fall of communism, this line was extremely thin. So of course he knew and did business with gangsters. The major crime bosses in St. Petersburg were in Putin's Rolodex too. The murder rate in St. Petersburg in the 90s was utterly insane. Many of the killings were gang-related, as various criminal organizations duked it out amongst each other for territory, resources, or influence. Putin seems to have influenced the criminal trial of a gangster named Vladimir Malashov, who ran the second largest gang in the city. Putin got him acquitted at a trial. The objective was to balance the major gangs against each other, so that no one group could take over the whole city. Despite Putin's efforts, it didn't work. Malashov's gang eventually lost out to a group called the Tambovsky gang, with whom Putin eventually had to do business. The Tambovsky gang threatened the corporate directors of the oil company based in Siberia that supplied most of the gasoline to St. Petersburg's filling stations. The oil company was trying to throttle the supply of gas to the city to extort a higher price. When the Tambovsky gang threatened the company, they gave in and allowed the gang to act as enforcers to ensure the flow of gasoline to the city. Putin approved this arrangement with the foundation of the St. Petersburg Petroleum Fuel Company. This company effectively turned the head of the Tambovsky gang, Vladimir Kumarin, from a gangster into a legitimate businessman and a major player in one of Russia's most important oil companies. This is not the only example of this kind of thing. The people who made this sort of transition from gang leaders to legitimate executives would eventually come to be known as oligarchs, a major cornerstone of Putin's rule of Russia in the post-1999 period. As a result of all this influence, Putin naturally increased his political power. After the constitutional mishigas of October 1993, which I'll discuss in the next chapter, the St. Petersburg city government was reorganized yet again, giving the mayor, Anatoly Sobchak, even more power. Because he had so many responsibilities, Sobchak had to delegate a lot of them to his aides, of which Putin was the most powerful and capable. In March 1994, Putin was appointed first deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. Technically, there were 3 people who held that rank. One of the others was a fellow called Vladimir Yakovlev. The other was Anatoly Chubais, who also comes up later. But Putin was the most powerful of the 3. You might be wondering throughout all this, was Putin still a KGB agent? He had, after all, first been assigned to trail Sobchak for the KGB. The answer is we don't know for sure. Putin claimed alternately that he had resigned officially from the KGB in June 1991, not long after Sobchak became St. Petersburg's mayor. He also claimed he wrote a letter of resignation during the coup in August. It's really not clear exactly when he quit the KGB, if he ever did. But by 1994, they were no longer giving him orders, and he was no longer taking them. He had definitely hitched his star to Sobchak, and that was where his loyalties lie. So, in the mid-1990s, Putin was arguably the most powerful man in St. Petersburg, at least behind the scenes. He had made himself indispensable to Anatoly Sobchak, who had himself become indispensable to the national government, even though he was often at odds with Yeltsin. Putin had his fingers in everybody's pockets: foreign banks and corporations, newly formed Russian companies, gangsters, future oligarchs, the people who supplied food to the city, the people who supplied gas to the city, everybody. And he was extremely low profile. You knew or knew of Mr. Putin if you did business in the city of St. Petersburg, but it's not like he was a nationally known figure. He was not a celebrity. Few people in all of Russia wielded more power with more subtlety than Vladimir Putin did. It's my hope that you're beginning to observe both the qualities that Putin was cultivating in himself and the eventual stepping stones of his rise to power. I've spent a lot of time on what he did while working in St. Petersburg city government because it's incredibly important to his story. The next chapter is going to focus less on Putin personally than on what was happening in Russia as a whole in the 1990s. It's necessary background as we set up the last act of the story, how Putin actually got to the top. Russia was an utter mess in the 1990s. Given everything that had happened, there was simply no way it couldn't have been. In 1917, the Bolsheviks had taken over the country at quite a vulnerable moment, the uncertain chaos following the collapse of the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty. The collapse of the Bolshevik regime in 1991 left the political, economic, and social fabric of Russia completely scrambled. Society just can't recover from this sort of thing quickly or easily. The rest of the world was perhaps not as sensitive to this reality as it should have been. There was a precedent in Russian history for this sort of chaos. In the late 1500s, Russia entered a tumultuous period following the death of Tsar Ivan IV, commonly known as Ivan the Terrible. Be very careful of that moniker, terrible, because it means something different in Russian than it does in English. Anyway, we don't have time to go into that. Ivan's son Fyodor I was a weak ruler, controlled by a regent, Boris Godunov, who himself became Tsar after Fyodor's death in 1598. Russia was already sliding into civil war during Godunov's reign, but it got worse after he died in 1605. Not one, not two, but 3 impostors who claimed to be Ivan IV's son Dmitri, who everyone thought had died in 1591, appeared and tried to claim the throne. Newsflash, the real Dmitri did die in 1591, but the pretenders had varying degrees of success in convincing others they were real, and they managed to raise followers and spread revolts throughout the realm. The period of chaos was marked by revolts, war, famine, and social disruption. The famine that began in 1601 killed nearly a third of Russia's population. Moscow was besieged. There was a war with the Poles. The whole country was just falling to pieces. The Russians call this period the time of troubles. In 1613, a parliament of Russia's noble families, called the Zemsky Sabor, convened to try to find a way out of the darkness, principally by electing a new czar that everyone, or at least most of the nobles, could agree on and rally behind. The person they chose was Mikhail Romanov, age 16, distantly related to Ivan IV. That began the Romanov dynasty, which lasted until 1917. It's significant that the usual narrative of Russian history is that it took a political compromise, specifically the accession of an autocratic ruler, to end the time of troubles and return the country to some sort of stability. This, I think, is exactly the same pattern that Russian history books of the future will project onto the history of the 1990s and 2000s. In this analogy, Putin is the modern equivalent of Mikhail Romanov. One could even argue that the oligarchs are the modern equivalent of the noble landowning families who supported Romanov and whose wealth was the basis of the dynasty's power. You could stretch that analogy too far, and I'm sure that someone will try to argue with it in the comments. Fine, whatever. But the point I'm making is that modern Russian history involving Putin's rise to power definitely has echoes in Russia's 17th century past, however imperfectly the template fits. Putin certainly wants you to think that he's the modern Mikhail Romanov. Russia's attempt to build a stable democracy post-communism hit a couple of major roadblocks early on. Yeltsin was popular because he had stood up to Gorbachev, who most people hated. He was the symbol of resistance during the August 1991 coup. After 2 years in power, though, Yeltsin had proved incapable of working with the Congress of People's Deputies. The issue was how Russia's constitutional government was going to work going forward. Would the president have most of the power with legislative input from the deputies, or would the deputies call most of the shots with the president carrying out their decrees? This is an old argument that confronts many societies coming out of revolutions or after a major regime change. The United States went through something similar during the Articles of Confederation period. On September 21st, 1993, Yeltsin, totally fed up, dissolved the Congress of People's Deputies. He had no legal right to do so, but something had to be done. The constitutional impasse was intractable. The deputies took refuge here, in this building, and blockaded it. It's known as the Russian White House, but it's not the residence of the Russian president, so it's not the equivalent of the American White House. In Moscow, demonstrators gathered favoring one faction or another, Yeltsin or the legislature. Tanks and troops were called out. On October 2nd, Russian tanks under Yeltsin's orders shelled the White House, setting the upper floors on fire. Violence spilled out into the streets of Moscow. The official death toll was 187, but that's probably a low estimate. This was the worst episode of street fighting in the Russian capital since the revolutions of 1917. Yeltsin ultimately came out on top. After all, he had tank battalions who were willing to obey his commands, and a new constitution, which he favored because it naturally gave him more power, was confirmed by a popular referendum in December 1993. Guess who was the legal scholar who took the laboring oar in drafting the new constitution? Anatoly Sobchak, of course, who had a reputation for being Russia's preeminent constitutional scholar. Sobchak's moonlighting as Russia's James Madison, while he was technically still the mayor of St. Petersburg and had a job to do there, was part of the reason why he delegated increasing amounts of authority to Putin. The violence in the streets of Moscow did not have an analog in St. Petersburg. That was partially due to Putin, who had military police stationed around the city to head off any incidents. There was, however, a political struggle going on in St. Petersburg's city government that mirrored the national-level constitutional crisis, and it ended similarly. St. Petersburg's new political settlement gave the mayor, Sobchak, more power. In addition to his problems at home and in the streets, Yeltsin had troubles abroad. After 74 years of being called the world's bad guy, Russia had finally jettisoned communism, but found no reward from the international community for having done so. In the early days after the end of communism, there was a little bit of talk in the West about some sort of massive program to rehabilitate Russia, similar in character to the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Western Europe after World War II. Nothing like that materialized. Indeed, the West, and particularly the United States, not just under Bush the First, but also his successor, Bill Clinton, seemed indifferent to Russia's problems and continued to keep the country at arm's length diplomatically. At worst, Yeltsin and many Russians, including Putin, saw the West as more or less maintaining its antagonism toward Russia. Understanding this attitude is actually pretty key because Putin definitely brought it with him into his own time as Russia's leader. Let's rewind just a bit to 1990. After the Berlin Wall fell and German unification was in the works, Bush I's Secretary of State, James Baker, assured Gorbachev that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the military and diplomatic alliance arrayed against the Soviet bloc in the Cold War, would not seek to expand by gaining new members among the Eastern European countries that had recently emerged from communist rule. Baker phrased this assurance categorically. Gorbachev received similar assurances from the leaders of France, West Germany, and the UK, Maggie Thatcher, the old Iron Lady herself. Baker, however, was undermined by Bush I's Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, who believed the U.S. should still be wary of Russia, and that NATO expansion was definitely still on the table. Bush himself typically tried to split the difference, maintaining publicly that NATO was still important, while still avoiding saying anything that would cause Gorbachev to go bananas. This issue was still unresolved when Bush was replaced as U.S. president by Bill Clinton. Yeltsin, now in charge in Moscow, believed that Baker's assurances and Margaret Thatcher's and John Major's were still policy. But in 1994, Bill Clinton reversed that and made it clear that NATO would expand into Central and Eastern Europe. Yeltsin blew his top. He felt betrayed, and one can understand why. Was NATO really a threat to Russia, though? One could argue that it was more symbolic than real, and that expanded NATO membership to various countries closer to Russia had no real consequences. That was until 1999 and NATO intervention in the Balkan Wars, but we're not there yet. One could also argue, as Gorbachev did, and Yeltsin after him, and Putin after him, that NATO, established in 1949 under Cold War circumstances, wasn't needed anymore, and that expanding it was just an upraised middle finger stuck right into Russia's face. Now, I don't have a dog in this fight, and it is not my purpose in this video to resolve that controversy. But just know that this was the international backdrop to Yeltsin's troubled stewardship of Russia in the 1990s. Now, we have to get into the Chechnya thing. This is complicated. Chechnya is a province of Russia located here in the North Caucasus region. It was not its own Soviet Socialist Republic in Bolshevik days, and its status as a country of its own has always been open to interpretation and argument, usually violent argument. Ivan the Terrible was the first Russian ruler to try to extend his influence into Chechnya through the Cossacks, a people who themselves have a specific cultural identity. I'm not going to get into any of that. During the Soviet era, Stalin was especially hard on Chechnya. The Chechens are mostly Muslims. Stalin feared they were Nazi sympathizers, so during World War II he had them forcibly deported to Kazakhstan, where about 60% of them died. After Stalin's death in the 1950s, the Chechens returned to Chechnya, but there was a great deal of hard feelings among them toward Russia and its rulers. In November 1991, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, the Chechens did what just about everybody, including the Estonians and the Ukrainians, were doing at about that time. They declared independence. The country they proclaimed was called the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. Russia, now under Yeltsin's control, refused to recognize Chechnya's independence. Here we get to the question, again, what is Russia? According to Yeltsin, Chechnya definitely was. A great deal of tumultuous politics ensued over the next 3 years, which we don't need to cover. Suffice it to say, annoyed with the Chechens' refusal to take orders from Moscow and an increasing escalation of military incidents, in November 1994, Yeltsin said F it and invaded Chechnya. The war did not go well for Russia. In kind of a mini foreshadowing of how Putin would do against Ukraine 30 years later, Yeltsin found that his military was generally pretty flabby. The command structure wasn't good, logistics were sometimes botched, and the Russian army simply couldn't land a knockout blow. The Russians also committed a number of war crimes and atrocities during this conflict: terror bombing, human shields, torture, ethnic cleansing, those sorts of things. Being Muslims, the Chechen resistance called for volunteers across the Islamic world to come to Chechnya to fight a jihad against the Russians. This was an echo of what happened in Afghanistan in the previous decade, as Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda was on the rise during the 1990s and heavily involved in Islamist movements in various countries. Numerous terrorists, who would later turn up fighting Americans in Afghanistan after 9/11, did tours of duty in Chechnya first. One of the Chechen commanders in this conflict was a fellow called Akhmed Kadyrov. He fought the Russians fiercely in this initial war, only later to turn in favor of them years later, largely as a result of meddling in the Chechnya conflict by Islamist jihad seekers. Kadyrov, who was assassinated in 2004, and especially his son, Ramzan Kadyrov, turned out to be friends and allies of Putin. I'm not going to get into that here, but I do cover the Kadyrovs both briefly in my Putin class on my website. Yeltsin's continued troubles in the First Chechen War, yes, turns out there'll be another one later on, were compounding his political difficulties. He also had problems with Anatoly Sobchak, who eventually became something of his nemesis. If you're getting the impression that Sobchak burned bridges easily and couldn't really cooperate with anyone for very long, except Putin, you're catching on. Elections for the Russian legislature, the Duma, in December 1993 didn't go well for Yeltsin. In addition to unexpected gains by the newly permitted Communist Party, a right-wing nationalist party led by a man called Vladimir Zhirinovsky also gained a lot of seats, reducing Yeltsin's influence over legislation. The Western press was particularly fascinated by Zhirinovsky, whom people thought erroneously might take over Russia and reboot the Cold War, to the point where an off-screen character in the submarine thriller film Crimson Tide was based on him. Zhirinovsky was never very important, but he was just one of the many thorns that ended up in Boris Yeltsin's rump during the mid-1990s. Anyway, Sobchak blamed Yeltsin for these legislative defeats. In fact, Sobchak was responsible for spreading the possibility that Zhirinovsky might take over the government, which was silly. Sobchak was also a critic of the Chechnya War. By the end of 1995, Yeltsin, who would have to stand for re-election the following year, was drowning in problems. Life in Russia itself was generally hard and unpleasant in these years. I already talked about the murder rate. Russia's suicide rate was also skyrocketing, and St. Petersburg's was among the highest in the world. Diseases like dysentery and diphtheria were running rampant. Many areas had rolling blackouts because municipalities couldn't keep the power on. There was a major social, spiritual, and collective mental health crisis in 1990s Russia, to go with the political and economic ones. You can see why Putin and others compared the situation of immediate post-Soviet Russia to the time of troubles of the 17th century. This period was extremely formative on Putin's philosophy of governance. It is exactly what he wanted to turn his back on once he got into power. In the next chapter, we get to another pivotal year of Putin's career, 1996. Boris Yeltsin was, in a word, problematic. He'd been a big hero when he stood on that tank in Moscow in August 1991, but 5 years later, when he stood for re-election as Russia's president, he was falling apart. Going into the 1996 election, his approval rating was about 10%. He wasn't healthy, he'd had 2 heart attacks. Previous year alone. He drank heavily. There are numerous embarrassing incidents involving drunk Boris Yeltsin in the historical record. Take your pick. My personal favorite is the one related by Bill Clinton, who claimed that while Yeltsin was visiting Washington, the Secret Service found Yeltsin blind drunk wandering around Pennsylvania Avenue in the middle of the night in his boxer shorts trying to hail a cab so he could go get a pizza. Yeltsin's chief opponents in the 1996 election were Gennady Zyuganov, the Communist Party candidate, and the aforementioned Zhirinovsky, the nationalist candidate. Exactly what Yeltsin should try to do to defeat them was a big question. Yeltsin was not served well by his campaign advisors, who had conflicting ideas on how to proceed. One of his campaign managers, led by a man called Alexander Korsakov, counseled that because Yeltsin couldn't win, he should instead declare a state of emergency and postpone the election for 2 years. That strategy, after Yeltsin rejected it, morphed into a different one, known as the Soskovets strategy, that urged Yeltsin to pull votes away from the nationalist Zhirinovsky by borrowing some of his rhetoric. Yeltsin didn't like that one either, and dissed Soskovets, the man who would come up with it. Ultimately, Yeltsin turned to a man named Anatoly Chubais. This person, an economist, had long been associated, even in the late Soviet era, with ideas of privatization and economic reform. Chubais eventually became one of the deputy mayors of St. Petersburg, along with Putin. And he was also for a time in charge of Yeltsin's program to privatize former Soviet state-owned property. Later, Chubais would become an oligarch, the head of Russia's electricity monopoly. Chubais' campaign strategy was that Yeltsin should run as the alternative to Russia backsliding into the past. Zhuganov and the communists naturally represented the past, although Zhirinovsky, not a communist, was obviously in the mix. Yeltsin relied heavily on his daughter, Tatiana, to manage the campaign from behind the scenes. The strategy eventually worked. A great deal of spin helped turn Yeltsin's image around. To combat the perception that he was in poor health, Yeltsin famously danced on stage at a music festival, a clip that went viral, including in Western media. And in May 1996, he concluded a ceasefire in the Chechnya War. It did not resolve any of the major issues in the conflict. It was just a ceasefire, but it certainly helped. Perhaps the key factor, though, was Yeltsin and Anatoly Chubais' strategy of ensuring positive media coverage of the Yeltsin campaign by Russia's major TV networks. They did this both with carrots and sticks. The stick was the threat that the Yeltsin administration would revoke major broadcast licenses. The carrot was that they apparently allowed Russian media moguls to acquire significant assets in formerly state-owned enterprises, part of that whole privatization scheme that both Chubais and Putin were involved in. This would later have the effect of cementing control of Russia's media by the oligarchs, another important factor in Putin's reign post-1999, as Putin clearly does control the Russian media today. So, in the summer of 1996, Yeltsin was re-elected. I want to say one more thing about his campaign. There was significant Western money and influence behind it. This went beyond 3 American political consultants, including one who had formerly advised Bill Clinton, who were hired by the Yeltsin campaign. The story of that later became a movie starring Jeff Goldblum called Spinning Boris. But there were also some secret loans by American interests to the Yeltsin campaign, and the International Monetary Fund provided some well-timed help to Russia, probably through the influence of President Clinton, who very much wanted Yeltsin to win. 20 years later, those who defended or excused Putin's meddling in the U.S. presidential election of 2016 would point to American meddling in Yeltsin's 1996 election as precedent. So where was Putin during the 1996 campaign? Well, he was working with Anatoly Sobchak, who was himself running for re-election as St. Petersburg mayor. I realize this is no small boast, but I think this election, the 1996 St. Petersburg mayoral race, is one of the most important electoral contests in recent world history. No one, including Putin, would have thought so at the time. Let's look at what happened and then I'll explain why it was so pivotal. There were several influential people who thought St. Petersburg needed a change of mayor in 1996. Most of them were connected to the business community, and they thought Sobchak was an effete intellectual who was too interested in promoting the arts and cultural profile of the city at the expense of business and the economy. Several potential candidates jockeyed around to try to defeat him. Ultimately, Sobchak's most important opponent was Vladimir Yakovlev, one of the other deputy mayors. Sobchak had been both Putin's and Yakovlev's common patron, so the mayor took this as a stab in the back, and as he tended to do, as a personal affront. He wanted to annihilate Yakovlev at the polls. Putin urged Sobchak to hire a professional team of campaign advisors. Sobchak instead hired his wife, Lyudmila Narusova, who quickly and completely screwed up his campaign. For example, she wasted his money on a campaign of posters so embarrassing that they had to be taken down. Most of Sobchak's supporters hated Narusova anyway and thought he was nuts to appoint his wife to so important a position. By the end of April, Sobchak's campaign was so completely in free fall that Putin stepped in. He and several other Sobchak deputies ordered a round of TV commercials that sought to show Sobchak as a friend of the working class. They also signed a public statement pledging to resign if he was defeated. This was a two-tiered election. In the first round of voting in late May, as everyone expected, Sobchak and Yakovlev got the highest number of votes, which meant the second round would be a runoff between them. Most observers thought Sobchak would win by a nose, but he had a disastrous television debate with Yakovlev, where Sobchak looked aloof and out of touch. Exactly the kind of snobbish intellectual that Yakovlev had been telling the voters Sobchak was. On June 3, 1996, St. Petersburg citizens went to the polls in the second and final round. Yakovlev got 47.5% of the vote, Sobchak 45.8%. This result literally changed the world. Why was it so important? Because if Sobchak had been reelected, Putin would have stayed in his office working for him at least for a considerable time more. But the fact that Sobchak was defeated ultimately caused Putin, who, as you recall, had publicly pledged to quit city government if Yakovlev won, to look for another job elsewhere. He probably wouldn't have wound up in Yeltsin's government and would not have been the prime minister when Yeltsin resigned in 1999. History turns on these sorts of tiny little hinges. 1996 was an important year for Putin for a few other reasons. In the spring, he enrolled at a college called the State Mining Institute in St. Petersburg to earn a degree as a candidate of sciences. This kind of thing is sometimes done in Russia, where a government official will earn an advanced degree on the side, usually in order to enhance his career credentials, particularly if he has ambitions to serve in the national government. In Putin's case, however, the degree was fraudulent. In June 1997, a dissertation was submitted to this college titled Strategic Planning for the Rehabilitation of the Mineral Resources Base in St. Petersburg and Leningrad Oblast. The dissertation was fake. Putin didn't write it. Part of it was plagiarized from a textbook, and other parts were cobbled together from various other sources. Putin probably had very little to do with the dissertation at all. It was instead compiled by Vladimir Litvinenko, who was the rector or head of the State Mining Institute. Litvinenko later became a major crony of Putin and his campaign manager in 2000 and 2004, as well as an oligarch with an interest in Russia's biggest fertilizer company. Vladimir Litvinenko should not be confused with Alexander Litvinenko, a former spy who was famously murdered by Putin in 2006 in an exotic assassination involving radioactive polonium. No relation, so far as I know. After Sobchak's defeat as St. Petersburg mayor, Anatoly Chubais, who was now working in Moscow in Yeltsin's cabinet, called Putin and asked if he wanted to come to the capital and work in Yeltsin's government. His name had already been floated in the Kremlin as a go-to guy who could get things done, and several former Sobchak people had already made the jump there. Though there was at first some confusion about what job Putin would have, ultimately he was appointed head of the legal department of the General Affairs Office in Yeltsin's government. This put Putin in charge of all state property owned by Russia abroad, mostly embassies, trade missions, and some former Soviet facilities that still hadn't been liquidated yet. On September 7th, 1996, Vladimir Putin, his wife, and daughters moved to Moscow, but they still had significant connections in and around St. Petersburg. One of them was this location, which is way off in the woods, about 50 miles north of St. Petersburg. It's called Osero. You remember the dacha concept, which has come up several times. Well, Putin first established a dacha in this area in 1990, but it burned down in 1996. This event was traumatic for Putin's family. His daughters, now aged 10 and 11, witnessed it and had nightmares about it for weeks afterwards. After the fire, which occurred in August 1996, Putin had the dacha immediately rebuilt just as it had existed before, only this time he brought in 7 of his friends who officially formed a cooperative for the property, where all their dachas would exist in a sort of gated community. That is Ozero, officially organized in November 1996. All the members of Ozero, except Putin, were prominent St. Petersburg businessmen. Later, all of them became either oligarchs or went into Putin's government. For example, Yuri Kovalchuk was a major player in Bank Rossiya, a major Russian bank that was mentioned prominently in the infamous Pandora Papers. Google it. 2 of the Ozero members later became involved in Gazprom, Russia's biggest company. Vladimir Yakunin, an Ozero investor, became Putin's Minister of Transport and President of the Russian Railways system. Ozero was the seed of Putin's web of relationships with oligarchs and business interests that arguably became the basis of his power as Russia's leader post-1999. You can imagine Putin's rise to power as him jumping between a series of platforms, kind of like a 3-dimensional chessboard. Each time it looked like a platform was about to collapse out from under him, like the KGB at the end of the Soviet era, or St. Petersburg city government after Sobchak's defeat, he managed to make a jump to a higher platform, which would put him in reach of ever higher positions. By the end of 1996, Putin was on the board of national-level government in Moscow. Granted, he was only on the corner of the board, with a bare foothold on it, but he was on the board. We have no way of knowing whether Putin was ultimately scheming at this time to become the leader of Russia. Personally, I believe he probably wasn't, but he was excellent at leveraging opportunities, and he got even better at it, as we'll see. So, this is why 1996 was a critical year for Vladimir Putin. No one knew it yet, but what happened that year brought him within reach of national power. Not bad for a kid who started out killing rats in a squalid apartment block in Leningrad. As I explained in the last chapter, Putin originally came to Moscow as head of the legal department of the General Affairs Office. He stayed in that position only 6 months. In March 1997, Yeltsin initiated a new economic program to fulfill some of his 1996 campaign promises, and to do it, he reshuffled the cabinet. Anatoly Chubais, future oligarch, became Minister of Finance, and Boris Nemtsov was named First Deputy Prime Minister. Several other administration officials were shifted around. One of the jobs that came open in this shakeup was head of the Main Control Directorate, which was also deputy head of Yeltsin's presidential administration. Chubais suggested that Putin get that job. He'd only been in Moscow a few months, but he'd already leapfrogged to a significantly higher position. In 1997, Russia had 2 main economic problems which were intertwined: taxes and the oligarchs. Remember that deal that Yeltsin and his people made to get favorable media coverage during the election? The payoff was that people who had influence in the media outlets, the oligarchs, were rewarded with the opportunity to buy major ownership positions in some of Russia's most important companies and industries. This was kind of a devil's bargain. The Russian state under Yeltsin couldn't collect tax revenue effectively, and the oligarchs in any event didn't really feel like paying taxes. In 1997, as part of his new economic program, Yeltsin insisted on tax reform, and Anatoly Chubais made it clear in no uncertain terms that going forward, privatization and sale of former Soviet state assets, which was still going on, would be done on a transparent basis, in contrast to the murky, crooked politics that had surrounded that sort of thing before. Putin was part of this process. He was tasked with cleaning house, so to speak, and helping the Russian government get its financial affairs in order. He and the others in the administration were pretty successful. They managed to cut state expenditures by 20% and vastly increase tax collection. The auctions of state properties were suddenly a lot more honest than they had been before. The oligarchs revolted. In July 1997, the government announced it was selling off a 25% interest in a state-owned communications firm called Svizinvest. 2 of the oligarchs, Boris Berezovsky and Vladimir Guzinski, wanted that interest. Both of these guys owned TV networks, ORT and NTV respectively, which had savaged communists in the 1996 election and helped Yeltsin win. They thought they were entitled to a piece of Svizinvest, and and they were incensed that Chubais and Nemtsov had the audacity to try to auction it honestly. The 25% stake of Svyazhinvest, by the way, went to a bank called Oneximbank. In the fall of 1997, Berezovsky and Guzinski, the oligarchs, publicized that a publishing company owned by Oneximbank had paid Chubais and a few of his friends an advance of $450,000 for a book on the history of privatization in Russia. No one, of course, expected a book on privatization to be a runaway bestseller that could command those kinds of numbers in the publishing industry. In other words, Oneximbank had bribed Chubais and Nemtsov to get a piece of Svyazhinvest using the publishing contracts as a front, which meant the whole thing about having the auctions be on the up and up now was completely bogus. This was the end of the line for Chubais. In November 1997, he resigned as finance minister. A few months later, in early 1998, Nemtsov got the boot too. The scandal had shown up the Yeltsin administration as hypocrites and thrown a monkey wrench into the plans to get the government's finances on a stable basis. It's also clear that this incident scared Putin, which is actually not that easy to do. You see, Putin himself by this time had a lot of ill-gotten gains that he made probably through the influence of rich and powerful friends. A civil servant, even one high in Yeltsin's government, didn't make that much in 1990s Russia. Yet somehow Putin had that dacha at Ozero with millionaire neighbors. He and his wife and daughters went on skiing trips to Switzerland and Finland. Lyudmila Putin went to Germany and Israel, and she bought so much designer crap overseas that one time an airline refused to check her bags because they were too heavy. Putin himself cut off his wife's credit card. She spent so much money. Where did it all come from? Well, where do you think? Putin had been making deals with foreign companies and Russian gangsters since his early days in the St. Petersburg city government. If the Yeltsin administration got too rambunctious about transparent finances and the rule of law, Putin himself might be outed as a hypocrite or a crook. Incidentally, the Yeltsin administration could never solve the problem of the oligarchs threatening the state, or the taxation problems that had a lot to do with them. Once he got into power, Putin, however, did solve this problem. That's in my online class. Hint, he took a page from the way the old imperial czars dealt with the boyars, the aristocratic landowners of Russia. That should not surprise you. By late 1997, Yeltsin was not doing well. He'd had quintuple bypass surgery the previous year and spent literally months in the hospital recuperating. He still had a problem with alcohol, which caused more embarrassing incidents, such as in Sweden in 1997, where Yeltsin compared meatballs to tennis star Bjorn Borg's face. It may not have been pure drunkenness. Bad interactions with prescription drugs or a neurological disorder that supposedly affected Yeltsin's balance have also been claimed to be at the root of these antics. Putin, while still acting as deputy head of presidential administration, leapfrogged through several other jobs in quick succession. Positions in the Kremlin were not always exclusive, meaning you could have more than one at the same time. I won't go through all that because the titles of the jobs Putin held aren't that important. But the big promotion for Putin came in the summer of 1998, and that was to head of the FSB, the renamed and slightly reorganized successor of the KGB. Yeltsin had gone through several chiefs of the KGB/FSB, and they were all pretty ineffectual. By summer 1998, Yeltsin was getting tired of the current chief, Nikolai Kovalyov, and then he was taken by surprise by a miners' strike that the FSB handled badly. While on vacation in Karelia on July 25, 1998, Yeltsin appointed Vladimir Putin as the head of the spy and secret police agency that he used to work for. At first, he was not happy. The FSB seemed to be a career dead end, but as the loyal apparatchik that he had to appear to be, he had no choice but to take it. As it would turn out, this appointment was absolutely key to Putin's final steps on his rise to power. That's in the next chapter. Putin's time as head of the FSB, though brief, was to have lasting consequences. He was now well known as a clean house kind of guy, a reformer and fixer, and after taking charge of the FSB in 1998, that's what he did, reorganizing, downsizing, merging departments, and trimming down the agency's budget. Naturally, he made a lot of enemies doing this. He also refocused the FSB's mission. Instead of spying on ordinary citizens, which as I said in an earlier chapter was a huge part of what the KGB had done in the Soviet era and kept doing afterwards, the FSB's priorities would be to fight terrorism and political extremism within Russia. That meant cracking down on nationalist sentiment, such as the kind which had caused such conflict with Chechnya. Yeah, sorry to spoil things, but Chechnya is about to pop up again. But a scandal quickly popped up instead. Several officers within the FSB alleged that the agency was corrupt and that there was a plot within it to assassinate Boris Berezovsky, the oligarch we talked about in the last chapter, on the orders of the Russian mafia. One of the whistleblowers on this scheme, who took it directly to Putin, was Alexander Litvinenko, not the one who wrote Putin's dissertation, but the rogue agent whom Putin would eventually have murdered in 2006. Putin didn't want to hear it, and even denounced Litvinenko on a TV news program. This scandal strained relations with Yevgeny Primakov, the prime minister, whom Boris Yeltsin had appointed in the wake of economic problems caused indirectly by the 1997 Asian financial crisis. We don't need to get into that. It's a long story. Primakov hated Berezovsky, but Putin actively cultivated the oligarch's friendship for strategic reasons. In the spring of 1999, several things came to a head. One of them involved NATO and the West. In an earlier chapter, I talked about how the decisions of U.S. presidents, especially Bill Clinton, to pursue NATO expansion pissed off the Russians. At first, the threat, if there was one, was theoretical. But in March of 1999, 3 new members joined the alliance: Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland, all of which had once been Soviet communist satellite states. Not long after that, for the first time in its 50-year history, NATO took coordinated military action, again at the behest of President Bill Clinton. NATO forces, dominated by British and Americans, began airstrikes against Serbia in an attempt to stop the Serbs' repressions against the mostly Muslim-populated province of Kosovo, where the Serbs were instigating a pretty horrific ethnic cleansing. Russia wasn't necessarily in favor of the ethnic cleansing, but they were alarmed by NATO airstrikes on a country populated by fellow Slavs. To understand this, you might want to go way back to my video on the July crisis that preceded World War I. Russia traditionally felt like it was sort of the protector of Slavic countries, and that sentiment was eventually why it got drawn into World War I. There was no broader war breaking out in the spring of 1999, but the Kosovo thing definitely alarmed the Russian government and demonstrated that they should probably regard NATO as a potential enemy. On May 12, 1999, while the Kosovo war was still going on, Yeltsin fired Yevgeny Primakov as prime minister. The reasons he did so are somewhat unclear, but it seems to have been at least in part because he feared Primakov, who was popular, might threaten him in the 2000 presidential election. That was assuming that Yeltsin would actually make it to the next election. In any event, Yeltsin replaced him with Sergei Stepashin. The thing was, it was clear that Stepashin was to be a temporary stopgap measure. Yeltsin expected Primakov to come back and bite his administration in the rear end in the Duma elections in 1999. There had to be yet another government reorganization to get everybody in place to survive that crisis. So, you see the forces that were converging here. Scandal at the FSB, tensions high because of the Kosovo thing, and turmoil in the prime ministership in advance of yet legislative elections that Yeltsin feared would go against him. By this time, I don't think there was any question that Putin was starting to see the end game that might lead him to achieving power. Then, sure enough, guess what long simmering problem blew up in Yeltsin's face? Yep, you guessed it, Chechnya. How this came about is exceptionally complicated. Suffice it to say, there was another restive region in this area, just next door to Chechnya, called Dagestan. In the summer of 1999, amidst a series of rising tensions and military incidents, Islamist extremists established 2 breakaway towns across the border in Dagestan, and Chechen separatists flocked to defend them. Stepashin was urging Yeltsin to invade Chechnya again in spring 1999, but the Kosovo thing postponed that. Once there was a ceasefire in Kosovo, and even more military incidents, renewed hostilities were on the brink of breaking out in Chechnya for the second time in a couple of years. Yeltsin was going to have to do something, amidst all the political chaos going on in the Russian government, and with his allies falling away, at long last, the guy Yeltsin decided to call was Vladimir Putin. In early August 1999, Putin was in St. Petersburg, where his father, sick with cancer, passed away. On August 5th, Yeltsin called Putin to his dacha outside Moscow, called Gorky 9, and told him he'd decided that he would appoint him prime minister in Stepashin's place. Putin claims that he told Yeltsin, quote, "I had not thought about that. I don't know if I am prepared for that." Was he talking about the post of prime minister, or Yeltsin's job, which he would have if Yeltsin resigned? Yeltsin seems to have hinted in this conversation that that might be in the cards. At first, Yeltsin's advisors, including Anatoly Chubais, were skeptical. Putin was fine, they didn't have anything against him, but they feared that the Duma would refuse to confirm him, and that would trigger early elections, where Yeltsin's opponents would win big. They went back and forth, trying to convince him to keep Stepashin on for a while longer, but Yeltsin stuck to his guns. On August 9th, 1999, Vladimir Putin was appointed Prime Minister of Russia. The fears about the Duma not accepting him were unfounded. He was approved a week later, on August 16th, narrowly, but approved. The Russian army was already counterattacking in Dagestan, and renewed hostilities with Chechnya proper were imminent. A host of foreign and domestic political problems had at last put Putin a heartbeat away from being the Russian head of state, and the heart standing in the way, Yeltsin's, was weak and already ravaged by numerous heart attacks. Then, perhaps the most infamous event on Putin's road to ultimate power occurred. The Moscow apartment bombings of 1999 are highly controversial, but undoubtedly instrumental in his story. I've given them their own specific chapter. That's the next one up. This is a shopping mall in Moscow called Okhotny Ryad. Its main concourse is underground, but it's located very close to Red Square, right in the heart of the capital. Here, on August 31st, 1999, a bomb exploded near the food court. One person was killed and more than 30 others injured. The Moscow Mall bomb was the first of a series of 5 incidents, not just in Moscow and not limited to apartment buildings, throughout the first few weeks of September 1999. A much larger attack occurred here. I'm not going to give you a 100% guarantee that it was this exact building you're looking at. I think it was, but if it's not, it was certainly near here, a 9-story apartment block on Guryanova Street in Moscow. This bomb killed 106 people and injured 249. These attacks, which collectively killed 307 people, shocked the Russian public. The Yeltsin administration was quick to blame them on Chechen separatists, and eventually they pointed fingers at a man called Achemez Guchiayev, who interestingly was not a Chechen, but a member of the Karachay ethnic group. They pointed to him as the mastermind of the attacks. Guchiayev, in fact, called police to report 2 additional bombs which were found in this apartment building and defused before they went off. On September 22nd, another whistleblower in the suburb of Ryazan, who had noticed a strange car in front of his apartment building, called police there, where they discovered more explosives and a timed detonator. If this one had gone off, it could have killed thousands of people in that densely packed part of the city. 3 suspects were identified who were connected to this defused bomb. 2 were arrested and found to be carrying ID cards issued by the FSB. Not surprisingly, days after this incident, a Moscow tabloid conjectured that the attacks were not the work of Chechens or their allies at all, but in fact had been engineered by the FSB to get the public behind a full-scale Russian invasion of Chechnya. Putin, who had just been appointed prime minister, was supposed to have been involved. This charge that Putin himself masterminded the apartment bombings has stuck to him for his entire career since then. Is it true? This gets us into the realm of conspiracy theories, which invariably surround events like terrorist attacks. There clearly were people who believed Putin did them. One of them was the aforementioned Alexander Litvinenko, who wrote a book on the subject, and whom Putin murdered in 2006 with polonium. Litvinenko's murder has sometimes been cited as proof by itself that Putin did it. The subject of the 1999 Moscow apartment bombings has unfortunately become sort of a litmus test for how one feels about Vladimir Putin in general. If you hate him and you think he's a tyrant, the new Hitler, and a threat to the peace of the world, you probably tend to think that he did order the bombings, or at least sanction their being carried out by the FSB. On the other hand, if you think Putin has been unfairly maligned by the world and that he's a strong leader we should all admire, you probably tend to think that he didn't do them and never could have. It really comes down to a question of character rather than of evidence. The evidence is inconclusive. It is true that there is not a lot to tie the bombings to Chechen separatists. Even though the guy Moscow claimed had done it, Ichamez Guchiayev, was not actually a Chechen. The materials used in the bombs found at Ryazan were materials that the FSB was generally in charge of guarding. And there's the matter of those suspects who had FSB ID cards. Is Putin ruthless enough to have done it? I think clearly the answer is yes, if you study his background. On the other hand, there is some evidence that the bombings were carried out by Islamists who were not Chechens, but retaliating against the Russian government's crackdown on Dagestan, on the border of Chechnya. Two associates of Ichamez Guchiayev, who were Islamists, reportedly gave partial confessions. The involvement of FSB people in the Ryazan thing, where the bombs failed to go off, might have been an FSB exercise. Those things are possible, and to admit that they're possible does not excuse the terrible things Putin has undoubtedly done. Nor does it cut against the political truth of how Putin ultimately used the bombings, which was in September 1999 to call for swift retaliation against Chechnya. That happened. The Second Chechen War began that month with an offensive launched shortly after the bombing incidents. Even if Putin knew that the apartment bombings were not carried out by Chechens, two things can be true of this at the same time. One, that the FSB did not do it, and two, that he was perfectly happy to claim the Chechens did it in order to drum up support for the military operation. We see this kind of thing in history a lot, where a politician uses an incident to their advantage and spins a false narrative about it without actually having caused the incident itself. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 is an example. At least one of two purported North Vietnamese attacks on American destroyers did undoubtedly occur, but many people conflate the Johnson administration's political use of that incident to get the Tonkin Gulf Resolution passed by Congress with a conspiracy theory that the incident was somehow ginned up out of whole cloth, which is absolutely not what happened. See my video on Watergate for a discussion on that. Similarly, most people assume that the Nazis, who had just come to power in Germany in early 1933, themselves caused the fire at the Reichstag building, the incident that Hitler used to declare a state of emergency. The Nazis most likely did not cause the fire themselves, but they clearly did use it for political benefit in a dishonest way. The Moscow apartment buildings are a much harder case than the Gulf of Tonkin or the Reichstag fire examples. Personally, I believe Putin probably did not do it, but I'm unwilling to say that there's no doubt of that conclusion, because there is, and I'm also unwilling to say that there aren't good reasons to think otherwise, because there are. The historical fact is that the apartment bombings clearly did pave the way for Putin cementing his power. Russian public opinion was generally in favor of attacking Chechnya in 1999, and Putin's public image of a tough terrorist fighter, which he first minted in the aftermath of the Moscow bombing crisis, carried him easily through the presidential election of 2000. Thus, even separated from the question of who was actually behind them, the apartment bombings are a key part of the story of his rise to power. In September 1999, while the Moscow apartment bombing crisis was still going on, President Boris Yeltsin canceled at the last minute his scheduled trip to the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference in Auckland, New Zealand. He decided to send Putin in his place. The APEC summit was one thing, but the big item on the agenda was that Yeltsin was supposed to meet with President Bill Clinton. Now it was Putin meeting with him. Yeltsin even told Clinton, when informing him of the change, that Putin was probably going to be the next president of Russia. The two leaders had met before. Clinton toured St. Petersburg in the 90s on a trip for which Putin was responsible for arranging security. Clinton, in fact, hadn't liked that visit and felt the security measures were too harsh. When they met again in New Zealand in September 1999, they tried to size each other up as potential leaders. Clinton thought Putin was formidable and capable, but he wasn't taken in, as George W. Bush and Donald Trump would eventually be. Putin's trip to New Zealand was his first turn on the world stage as a potential leader of Russia. Most of the world missed its importance. Yeltsin was sick, and starting to fade from prominence, but no one other than hardcore Russia wonks perceived that they were looking at the long-term future of the regime. Putin was still virtually unknown outside Russia in 1999, but he was taking his last few steps toward the consolidation of power. One of those steps was, of course, the war against Chechnya. While Putin's public image was a strong man, determined to wipe out the terrorists threatening Russians, there are some indications that he was hesitant at first and a little unsure of himself. That was the opinion of Gleb Pavlovsky, a political advisor to Putin. He told journalists later, quote, "We had hoped that he would distance himself from Chechnya, because, without exception, all politicians who have taken on Chechen wars have bitten the dust. It's a cemetery, a political graveyard. No one comes out of a Chechen war looking good," end quote. But somehow Putin did, and once he'd decided to go ahead, he stuck with it. By the end of September, the Russian invasion force was gauged at 50,000 troops. "We must stamp out the vermin," Putin said. "If we do not do it today, it will be worse tomorrow." Within a few months, Russian forces had turned Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, into a pile of smoking rubble. In moving strongly against Chechnya, Putin was actually doing a pretty daring thing. He was prime minister, not president, and his boss, Yeltsin, had signed a ceasefire with Chechnya in 1996. Putin was publicly repudiating the policy of his own superior while Yeltsin was still in office. It's hard to imagine any other Russian government official getting away with something like that. The move was popular. Pollsters within Russia were starting to add Putin's name to the list of possible candidates for the 2000 election. At first because he was so unknown. In August 1999, Putin had about 2% support in the polls for the upcoming election. Yes, 2%. By November, he was at 30% and rising. Keep in mind, Russian elections are multi-party, not bipolar, so a candidate with 30 or 40% support, which is where they clocked him in December, is an overwhelming frontrunner, even though his numbers hadn't cracked 50%. It's amazing to take stock of where Putin was and how far and how fast he'd come in the 3 years since he left St. Petersburg. In the summer of 1996, he was an obscure, though powerful, official in the St. Petersburg city government, the right-hand man of a now unpopular politician who had just been defeated for the mayorship. 3 years later, Putin was the number 2 man in Yeltsin's government, making alone big decisions on whether to take his country to war. Putin had never won a single election. He had never even been a candidate. None of the positions he'd had, deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, deputy head of Yeltsin's presidential administration, head of the FSB, prime minister of Russia, none of those positions required persuading a majority or even a plurality of voters to like him. Now he was the frontrunner in the entire nation for the top spot. Though Putin was not running himself, it did take one last election to get him into the big chair. The elections for the Duma, Russia's parliament, were scheduled for December 19th, 1999. It was a dirty and acrimonious campaign, with candidates from all over Russia flinging mud at each other. However, Putin and Yeltsin had a finger on the scale. ORT, the television network owned by Boris Berezovsky, the oligarch, pitched in to talk up Yeltsin's party and to fire hose mud at the opposition. Berezovsky obviously expected, if he helped position Putin to take national power the following year, that there would be a quid pro quo that would allow him, and probably the other oligarchs, to keep their fortunes intact. Spoiler alert, there would be. On December 14th, 1999, 5 days before the election, Yeltsin met with Putin and told him he was going to resign. Putin would be his successor as president of Russia. The idea was to give Putin the advantage of an incumbent in the upcoming election scheduled for June, and also to spare him the result of any further missteps that Yeltsin might make in the next 6 months. It couldn't be announced before the Duma election, of course. Of this meeting and his reaction, Putin said, "It would be stupid to say, no, I'd rather sell sunflower seeds." Of course he was going to take the job. Russia was basically his for the taking. In the Duma elections, the Communist Party won the largest single bloc, 113 seats out of 450. However, the party Putin favored, called Jedinstva, won 73 seats, and in partnering with two other anti-communist parties, Putin would have a working majority in the parliament. This was the last step that needed to fall into place. On December 27th, Yeltsin and Putin met again in the Kremlin to hammer out the details of the transfer of power. Putin was already working on the document that would become his millennium message. The world was, at that moment, preparing for the big party, the changeover to the year 2000. The significance of the changeover in Russian leadership would, in the headlines of the world, likely be overshadowed by that. On the afternoon of New Year's Eve, Yeltsin gave a feeble and forgettable farewell address, in which he begged for the forgiveness of the Russian people for his mistakes and missteps. He looked old and sick during this speech, because he was. Reportedly, the last thing Yeltsin said to Putin as he was walking out of the Kremlin was, "Take care of Russia." This is where we came in, and here again is how Vladimir Putin came onto the world stage, a dull, halting speech given in front of a Christmas tree, while the rest of the world was partying. He had a lot to celebrate too, but it had nothing to do with Y2K. His rise to power was now complete. You know what happened to Putin after New Year's Day 2000. He remains the leader of Russia today, nearly 25 years later, and probably will be until the time of his death. Here is what happened to some other people mentioned in our story. Putin's parents, Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin and Maria Ivanovna Putina, continued to live in St. Petersburg and were quite proud of their only surviving son. Neither of them quite lived to see him achieve power as president of Russia. As I mentioned earlier, Putin's father died in August 1999, just before he was named prime minister. His mother, Maria, had died the previous year, 1998. A Georgian woman named Vera Putina, in the long tradition of people claiming to be long-lost relatives of Russian rulers, claimed that she was Putin's real mother, but there was no evidence to back her story, and it seems unlikely to be true. Vera Putina died in 2023, still sticking to her story. Putin's wife, Lyudmila, chafed against her husband's traditionalist view of the role of women throughout his career and rise to power. She did remain with him long enough to become the First Lady of Russia, and for some time afterwards. As First Lady, she ran a foundation dedicated to the study of the Russian language. Very little is known about the state of her marriage with Putin, but it must have been bad. In 2013, the Kremlin announced that Vladimir and Lyudmila Putin were divorcing. She's kept a low profile since then, marrying her second husband, a Russian businessman, in 2015. Maria, now Maria Vorontsova, Putin's eldest daughter, became an endocrinologist. She's believed to be working somewhere in her father's government. Rumor has it on projects involving genetic engineering, which is frankly too terrifying to think about. The younger daughter, Katerina Tikhanova, is a physicist and mathematician who has worked at Moscow State University, reportedly on projects involving AI, another wholly terrifying possibility. Anatoly Sobchak, former mayor of St. Petersburg, was hounded by the press and prosecutors for a scandal involving the privatization of apartments belonging to him and his relatives. This campaign may have been drummed up by the Yeltsin administration to neutralize Sobchak as a potential candidate in future campaigns. In 1997, Sobchak fled to Paris to escape these charges until they were dropped at Putin's insistence in 1999. He returned to Russia and campaigned for his former protege in the 2000 presidential election, until Sobchak suddenly died on February 20th, 2000. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but there have been persistent rumors that he was poisoned. Before you point fingers, understand that Sobchak was an enthusiastic supporter of Putin at the time of his death, so if he was murdered, it was probably not by him. Gennady Zyuganov, the Communist Party candidate who ran against Yeltsin in 1996, is still alive and still the chairman of the Russian Communist Party. In the Putin era, he's generally been the token opposition to Putin in his various presidential elections, often coming in a distant second. Zyuganov has been a critic of Putin, but not a very influential one. For example, he supports the Russian war against Ukraine. Putin does not seem to take him very seriously. Vladimir Zhirinovsky, the nationalist leader of the deceptively named Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which was neither liberal nor democratic, remained in Russian politics until the end of his life. A virulent and outspoken nationalist, Zhirinovsky defended many of Putin's positions and was typically the voice arguing in the political arena that Putin didn't go far enough. He was widely rumored to have been secretly gay. Zhirinovsky died in 2022. Putin attended his funeral. Anatoly Chubais, the oligarch who served in Yeltsin's administration and who opposed Putin's appointment as prime minister on strategic grounds, remained the head of Russia's largest electricity utility until 2008, then moved to another company called Rosnanotek. He was not a member of Putin's trusted inner circle. Chubais opposed Putin's invasion of Ukraine and wisely fled to Turkey the day after the invasion began. He currently lives in Israel and is reportedly in poor health. Boris Berezovsky, another oligarch whose TV network contributed to Yeltsin's and Putin's electoral victories, quickly fell out with Putin after he was in power, most publicly over Putin's handling of the submarine Kursk disaster. Berezovsky sold off most of his assets, and the Kremlin eventually got control of his networks. He went into exile in Great Britain, where he remained a vocal critic of Putin. He also went into business with Neil Bush, son of President George Bush I and brother of the second. He died in Berkshire, England in 2013. Supposedly he hanged himself, but as with nearly everyone who made enemies of Putin and who died an unnatural death, there have been persistent rumors that he was murdered. He had apparently tried to mend fences with Putin at the very end of his life. Vladimir Litvinenko, the rector of St. Petersburg Mining University and the man who wrote Putin's fraudulent dissertation, is still alive and still in that office. He managed Putin's presidential campaigns in 2000 and 2004. Alexander Litvinenko, no relation, former FSB agent who accused Putin of trying to assassinate Berezovsky and later of masterminding the Moscow apartment bombings, fled Russia in October 2000 and, like Berezovsky, ultimately settled in London. He suffered one of the most famous assassinations in espionage history, having been poisoned with radioactive polonium on Putin's orders while having drinks at the Pine Bar of the Millennium Hotel in London. He died on November 23, 2006, a bit more than 3 weeks after the poisoning. At the time of his resignation from office on the last day of 1999, Boris Yeltsin's approval rating among the Russian public was 2%. Exhausted and sick, he retired to his home in Moscow and kept a low profile. His health continued to deteriorate, but still he continued to take foreign trips now and again, and together with his former communist rival Mikhail Gorbachev, was a mild critic of Putin. Yeltsin's final hospitalization lasted 12 days. On April 23, 2007, he died, not surprisingly, of congestive heart failure. Putin declared a national day of mourning for the man who had made him acting president of Russia. Yeltsin was the first Russian leader since Tsar Alexander III to have a formal contemporaneous funeral in the Russian Orthodox Church. As I stated at the beginning, the thesis of my online class on Vladimir Putin, of which this video is a companion piece, is that the key to understanding Putin is to see him in the broader context of Russian history and other Russian rulers of the past. The thesis of this video is that before you can place Putin in that proper context of Russian history and previous Russian rulers, you have to understand where he came from and how he came to power in 1999. I hope I've given you some glimpse of that understanding. Putin matters. He's had a huge role in shaping the world as it exists today, and he will continue to have a huge role in shaping it in the future. In my view, anyone who wants to understand what the world is like today must understand Vladimir Putin And that understanding, I think, begins with his history. That's why I made this video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it, recommend it to others, do all the stuff that you normally do for a video you like. The sources I used to make this video are listed in the credits at the end and also in the description. No part of the research or writing of this video was done with AI. I teach history courses on my website, seanmunger.com. I also write books, mostly fiction. My latest is a mystery novel, Daniel Vanished, which is available on Amazon Kindle and in paperback. The link to that is in the description. Thank you to all my fans and supporters, and thank you once again for joining me on another journey into the past.